Chapter 11 of the Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 11 The Mystery of the Lutine Frigate. Harbored in the stately edifice of the Royal Exchange, down in the heart of London City, is that ancient and powerful corporation known to seafaring men the world over as Lloyd's. Its chief business is the underwriting of maritime insurance risks, and its word is law wherever fly the house flags of merchant shipping. More than 200 years ago, one Edward Lloyd kept a coffee house in Tower Street, a thoroughfare between Wapping and the Thames side of the city, and because of its convenient situation, the place became a popular resort for sea captains, underwriters, and insurance brokers who discussed such important matters as arrivals in port, wrecks, missing ships, and rumors of war. In time, Lloyd's Coffee House was recognized as a sort of unofficial headquarters for this special variety of insurance speculation, and the gentlemen most active there drifted into a loosely formed organization for the purpose of making the business less hazardous. In 1773, this association of underwriters moved into the Royal Exchange, taking the name of Lloyd's, and later appointed a governing body or committee to control the more adventurous spirits who were fond of gambling on the chances of war, on the length of Napoleon's life, and who would undertake to insure a man against the risk of twins in his family. From this beginning grew the vastly influential and highly organized Lloyd's of the present day, which is something more than a corporation. It is also an aggregation of individual underwriters and brokers carrying on business, each for his own personal profit and on the strength of his good name and resources. As a corporation, Lloyd's has no financial liability in the event of the failure of any of its members or subscribers. All that Lloyd's does, in its corporate capacity, is to permit the admission only of men of stability and sound repute by means of stringent tests, and to exact a money guarantee or deposit from its members in the sum of £5,000 or £6,000, together with entrance fees of £400 and annual fees of 20 guineas. These payments form what may be called a reserve fund, and the individual underwriter writes his own policies. If the risk is heavier than he wishes to assume, he divides it among his fellows. There are few more interesting places in London than Lloyd's, encrusted as it is with the barnacles of conservative tradition, and hedged about with all the exclusiveness of a club. The entrance is guarded by a burly porter, gorgeously arrayed in the scarlet robes and gold-banded hat of a bygone century. Having run the gauntlet of this dragon, one is likely to see the underwriter's room, where hundreds of members and their clerks are quartered at rows of little desks, or boxes, every man of them with his hat clapped on his head, as decreed by ancient custom. There is always a crowd of them around the arrival book and the lost book, in which are posted the movements of vessels in every port of the world, and the wrecks that number 3,000 every year. The famous captain's room, where the mariners used to gather and swap briny yarns, is now used for the prosaic purposes of luncheon and for the auction sales of ships. In the two large and handsome rooms used by the secretary and by the committee of Lloyd's are many interesting relics of the earlier history of this body. Here is the oldest policy known to the annals of maritime insurance, a faded document issued on January 20th, 1680, for £1,200 on a ship, Golden Fleece, and her cargo, on a voyage from Lisbon to Venice, at £4 per cent premium. Hanging on these walls are also a policy written on the life of Napoleon, and an autographed letter from the Duke of Wellington as warden of the Cinque Ports. The most conspicuous furnishings of the committee room are a huge table, highly polished, of dark wood, a magnificently carved armchair, and a ship's bell. The table bears a silver plate inscribed as follows: His Britannic Majesty's ship La Lutine, 32-gun frigate, commanded by Captain Lancelot Skinner, Royal Navy, sailed from Yarmouth Road the morning of 9 October 1799, with a large amount of specie on board, and was wrecked off the island of Lyland the same night, when all on board were lost except one man. The rudder of which this table was made, and the rudder chain and the bell, which the table supports, were recovered from the wreck of the ill-fated vessel in the year 1859, together with a part of the specie, which is now in custody of the Committee for Managing the Affairs of Lloyd's. chair has a similar inscription, and these pieces of furniture serve to remind the visitor that Lloyd's has a lost treasure story of its own. The flavor of piracy is lacking, true enough, but the tragedy of the Lutine frigate possessed mystery and romance nevertheless, and is worthy of a place in such a book as this. As the owner of a treasure lost more than a century ago, the Corporation of Lloyd's still considers the frigate a possible asset, and as recently as May 31st, 1910, Captain E. F. Inglefield, the Secretary of Lloyd's, wrote the author as follows. Various attempts have been made, with the sanction of Lloyd's, to recover further treasure, but it was not until 1886, when steam suction dredgers were first employed, that any results worthy of notice were obtained. A number of coins and other relics to the value of about £700 were obtained. In 1886, also, 2 guns were recovered from the wreck, one of which, after being suitably mounted on a naval gun carriage, was presented by Lloyd's to the Corporation of London, and has been placed in the museum at the Guide Hall. The other was graciously accepted by Her late Majesty Queen Victoria, and was forwarded to Windsor Castle. In 1891, a few coins of small value were recovered. Since that date, operations have been continued at various times by salvors under agreement with Lloyd's, but nothing of intrinsic value has since been obtained. In 1896, a cannon which was afterwards presented to Her Majesty Queen Wilhelmina of Holland by the Committee of Lloyd's was found together with some small pieces of the wreck, etc. In 1898, some timber weighing about 200 weight was recovered from the wreck and was presented to the Liverpool Underwriters Association, whose chairman, Mr. S. Cross, had a chair made from the wood, which he presented to that association. A company which was formed for the purpose of continuing operations has made efforts at various times, but the site is extremely exposed, and owing to bad weather, it has often been found impossible to continue dredging operations for more than a few days each year. I trust the above information may be of service to you, but I may add that I understand that it is this year intended to operate with some new apparatus. Some light was thrown on this latest enterprise by the publication of the following in a recent issue of Lloyd's Weekly Newspaper of London. Sea Treasure Getter, novel machine to be used for raising sunken wealth. An extraordinary machine was towed to the mouth of River Colne off Brightlingsea and anchored on Thursday. It is to be used in a final attempt to recover £500,000 treasure of gold in coin and bars, which is said to have gone down in His Majesty's ship Lutine in 1797 near the island of Terschelling off the coast of Holland. A portion of the treasure has been recovered, but the ordinary dredging plant is now useless, as the vessel has sunk into the sand. The new device is a great steel tube nearly 100 feet in length and wide enough to allow a man to walk erect down its center. At one end is a metal chamber provided with windows and doors, and at the other a medley of giant hooks and other tackle. The apparatus has just been completed after years of work by Messrs. Forrest and Company, shipbuilders, in their Wivenhoe yard. On one end of the tube, it is explained, will be clamped to the side of the steamship or barge. The other end, by means of water ballast tanks, will be sunk until it touches the bottom. Then, by means of compressed air, all the water will be forced from the tube and also from the chamber at the bottom of it, which will be flush upon the bed of the sea. Divers will walk down a stairway in the center of the tube until they reach the submerged chamber. Here they will don their diving costumes and, opening a series of watertight doors, will step out into the water. Engineers will be stationed in the chamber, and following the instructions of the divers, will communicate with them by means of portable telephones. They will operate the mechanism of 2 powerful suction pumps, or dredges, which are fitted to the sides of the tube. These dredges, it is hoped, will suck away the sand around the sides of the heavy chamber until it gradually sinks by its own weight right down onto the deck of the wrecked ship. Then the divers, making their way from the chamber to the deck of the ship, and thence to the hold, will be able to transfer the treasure from the ship to the chamber by easy stages. How Lloyd's happens to own a treasure frigate of the English Navy, lost more than a century ago, is explained in the following narrative, many of the facts of which were found in History of Lloyd's and of Maritime Insurance in Great Britain by Frederick Martin, a work now out of print. On October 19, 1799, the Gentleman's Magazine of London contained this news. Intelligence was this day received by the Admiralty from Admiral Mitchell, communicating the total loss of La Lutine of 32 guns, Captain Skinner, on the outward bank of the Fly Island Passage, on the night of the 9th instant, In a heavy gale at north-northwest, La Lutine had on the same morning sailed from Yarmouth Roads with several passengers and an immense quantity of treasure for the Texel, but a strong lee tide rendered every effort of Captain Skinner to avoid the threatened danger unavailable, and it was alike impossible during the night to receive any assistance, either from the Arrow, Captain Portlock, which was in company, or from the shore, from whence several shouts were in readiness to go to her. When the dawn broke, La Lutine was in vain looked for. She had gone to pieces, and all on board unfortunately perished, except 2 men who were picked up, and one whom has since died from the fatigue he has encountered. The survivor is Mr. Shabrock, a notary public. In the annals of our naval history, there has scarcely ever happened a loss attended with so much calamity, both of a public as well as a private nature. In almost all the accounts of the wreck of the Lutine, it is stated as a fact that the frigate was bound to the Texel, and that the bullion and treasure she carried, and which was lost in her, was designed for the payment of the British forces in the Netherlands. Both statements are without foundation, as proved by a careful search in the archives of the Admiralty. These official records show that the Lutine was under orders to sail, not to the Texel, but to the River Elbe, her destination being Hamburg, and that the treasure on board was not the property of the British government, but of a number of London merchants connected with Lloyd's, and that the business of sending the coin and bullion was purely commercial. The records wholly fail to explain how it happened that, sailing for the mouth of the Elbe, the Lutine, commanded by an able and experienced officer, and in all respects well manned and found, came to be driven, within 18 hours after leaving Yarmouth Roads, upon the dangerous shoals of the Zuider Zee, far out of her course, even when every allowance is made for the strength of a northwesterly gale. Another mystery of the voyage of this 32-gun frigate of the Royal Navy is her employment as a mere packet, carrying cash and bullion for the benefit of private individuals. The officer responsible for sending the Lutine on this unusual errand was Admiral Lord Duncan, who received a pressing invitation from some merchants to convey a quantity of bullion. It was his first intention to dispatch a cutter, but the treasure given in his care was swelled by larger amounts until its total value was £1,175,000, or more than $5.5 million. The admiral thereupon discarded the cutter and selected instead the swift and staunch Lutine frigate, one of the best vessels of his fleet. On October 9th, he wrote the Admiralty from on board his flagship, the Kent, in Yarmouth Roads. Merchants interested in making remittances to the continent for the support of their credit, having made application to me for a king's ship to carry over a considerable sum of money, on account of there being no packet for that purpose, I have complied with their request and ordered the Lutine to Cuxhaven with the same, together with the mails lying there for want of conveyance, directing Captain Skinner to proceed to Stromness immediately after doing so, to take under his protection the Hudson Bay's ships and see them in safety to the Nore. When this letter was written, the Lutine had already sailed, and before Lord Duncan's communication reached the Lords of the Admiralty, the splendid treasure-laden frigate had laid her bones on the sandbanks of Holland. Admiral Duncan appears to have escaped all censure for this disaster, which followed his actions taken without consultation and without waiting for the approval of his superiors. The merchants of London were powerful enough to command the services of the Navy, and English credit was needed on the continent to buttress English arms and statesmanship. With her millions of treasure and hundreds of lives, the Lutine drove straight toward as fatal a coast to shipping as can be found anywhere in the world. It is a coast which is neither sea nor land, strewn with wrecks, and with somber memories even more tragic, whereas now the entrance of the Zuider Zee was unbroken terra firma until the 13th century, when a terrible hurricane piled the North Sea through the isthmus, separating it from the large lake called Vlies by the natives. A wide channel was cut by this inroad, and in 1287 the North Sea scoured for itself a second inlet at the cost of 100,000 human lives. Ever since then, channels have been multiplying and shifting until what was once the coastline has become a maze of islands and sandbanks. The Texel, Vineland, Terschelling, Amland, and hundreds of lesser ones, which confuse even the mariners born and bred among them. With a wind which should have enabled him to give this perilous shore a wide berth and to keep his course up to the North Sea, Captain Skinner plunged into a death trap from which there was no escape. The sole survivor could give no coherent account, and he died while on the way to England before his shattered nerves had mended. There was no more frigate, and as for the hundreds of drowned sailors, they had been obliterated as a day's work in the business of a great navy. So the Admiralty left the mourning to their kinfolk, and bestirred itself about that $5.5 million worth of treasure which the sea could not harm. Vice Admiral Mitchell was informed by letter that their lordships feel great concern at this very unfortunate accident, and he was directed to take such measures as might be practicable for recovering the stores of the Lutine, as well as the property on board, being for the benefit of the persons to whom it belongs. The underwriters of Lloyd's, with an eye to salvage, were even more prompt than the Admiralty in sending agents to the scene of the wreck. The greater part of the immense amount of coin and bullion had been fully insured, a transaction which indicates the stability and ample resources of this association as far away in time as 1799. The loss was paid in full, and with such promptitude that only 2 weeks after the disaster, the Committee for Managing the Concerns of Lloyd's addressed a letter to the Secretary of the Admiralty, in which was requested the favor of Mr. Nepean to lay before the Lords Commissioner of the Admiralty the information that a sum of money equal to that unfortunately lost in the Lutine is going off this night for Hambro, and they trust their lordships will direct such steps as they think expedient for its protection to be taken. The request was granted somewhat grudgingly. Apparently, the Admiralty regretted the employment of one of its frigates as a merchantman. Admiral Lord Duncan was directed to send a convoy this time, but was told also to let them know that their lordships have done so in this particular case, but that they must not expect the packets can again be convoyed. With this letter ends all reference to the Lutine and her treasure in the correspondence preserved in the record office of the Admiralty. Having paid their losses like the good sportsmen that they were, the underwriters of Lloyd's thereby clinched their right to the ownership of the treasure, provided they could find it. The situation was complicated because England was at that time at war with the Netherlands, whose government claimed the wreck as a prize, although inconsistently refusing to let it be adjudicated by a prize court. On this account, Lloyd's could make no attempt to fish for the treasure, which delay was very much to the benefit of the sturdy Dutch fishermen of the islands at the mouth of the Zuider Zee. The sands and the surf held a golden harvest. The wreck of the Lutine was partly exposed at low ebb tide, and the channel ran close to the side of the ship. The clumsy fishing boats, or shouts, swarmed the place, and never was there such easy wealth for honest Dutchmen. Their government soon put a watch on them and took 2/3 of the findings, giving the fishermen the remainder. They toiled in good weather for a year and a half, and recovered treasure to the amount of £83,000 sterling. The official inventory reads like the hoard of a buccaneer, including as it does such romantic items as 58 bars of gold, weight 646 pounds, 23 ounces. 35 bars of silver, weight 1,758 pounds, 8 ounces. 41,697 Spanish silver pistols. 179 Spanish gold pistols. 81 double louis d'ors. 138 single louis d'ors. 4 English guineas. At the end of the year 1801, the fishermen quit their task, thinking they had found all the treasure. For a dozen years the Dutch forgot the melancholy fragments of the Lutine, while the sailors of the desolate islands guarding the Zuider Zee began to weave superstitious legends around the gold wreck. In the midst of the crowded events of the Great War against Napoleon, England found no time to remember the Lutine, and her memory was kept alive only by the kinfolk of the drowned officers and sailors. After Napoleon had been finally disposed of, the treasure was recalled to public notice by an ingenious gentleman of the Netherlands, Pierre Eschauzer, a sort of lord of the manor under the government, holding the post of Opperstrandvander, or Upper Strand Finder, who lived at Terschelling and took a lively interest in the wreck. After a great deal of investigation and cogitation, he arrived at the conclusion that the greater part of the treasure dispatched from England in the Lutine was still hidden among her timbers. His argument was based on the fact that the bars of silver and gold already recovered were stamped with certain numbers and letters indicating series or sequences, and that thus far these were very incomplete. For instance, among the gold bars previously found were 13 marked with the letters NB in 3 separate lots, the first numbered from 58 to 64, the second from 86 to 90, and the third from 87 to 89. Other gold bars with different letters and a variety of numbers went to prove that there were 100 numbers to each letter, which would yield a total of 600 gold bars, of which only 31 had been recovered in the years 1800 and 1801. The government of the Netherlands was duly impressed by the calculations of Mr. Eschauzer, who had proved himself such an astute Upper Strand Finder, and he was granted a sum by royal decree from the public exchequer to equip a salvage operation. Alas, the pretty theory was thwarted by the implacable sands which had buried the wreck. For 7 years this indefatigable treasure-seeker dredged and dug and found no more than a few gold coins. Then he decided to try a diving bell, King Willem I having bestowed upon him a more favorable privilege by the terms which the salvage company was to have one half of the treasure recovered. The diving bell was no luckier than the dredges had been. In fact, by this time the unstable sands had so concealed the wreck that it could not be found. After vainly groping for several months, the luckless Upper Strand finder confessed himself beaten, and there was nothing to show for an expenditure of £5,000 sterling. These operations had made some noise in London, however, and the underwriters of Lloyd's remembered that they had an interest in the wreck of the Lutine frigate. If there was still treasure to be sought for, it belonged to them, and the government of the Netherlands had no claim upon it, either in law or equity. The fact that the royal decrees had been granting the Dutchmen that which did not belong to them at all aroused indignation at Lloyd's, whose managing committee was moved to address the English government in the matter. After a good deal of diplomatic palaver with The Hague, that government made over its half-share of the treasure reserved under the treaty with the Upper Strand finder to the British claimants. In May 6, 1823, Mr. F. Cottingham, Secretary of the English Foreign Office, communicated this pleasing news to Mr. William Bell, Chairman of the Committee of Lloyd's, in the following letter. Sir, with reference to the several applications which have been made to His Majesty's government to interfere with that of the Netherlands on behalf of the underwriters and others, claiming to be allowed to recover certain properties still supposed to remain aboard the Lutine frigate, lost off the coast of Holland in 1799, I am directed by Mr. Secretary Canning to acquaint you, for the information of the parties concerned, that after much negotiation, His Netherlands Majesty has expressed his willingness to cede to the British claimants the whole of that moiety of the said property, which by His Netherlands Majesty's decree of the 14th September 1821 was reserved for the use of His said Majesty. The other moiety was, by the same decree, granted in the nature of salvage to a private company of his own subjects, who undertook to recover the cargo at their own expense. It has been stipulated that the British claimants shall be at liberty to concert with the said company as to the best mode of effecting that recovery. Considering the difficulties which the negotiation has experienced from disputed points of law, and making due allowance for the engagements formed with the Dutch company, who have been recognized as salvers by the Dutch law, and would have a right to have all services rewarded in the courts of Holland for the property which may be saved by their exertions, Mr. Canning apprehends that it may be advisable for the claimants in this country to agree to the offer now made. The season for operation is now before them, and no hope could be reasonably entertained that a renewal of the negotiation would bring the matter to a more reasonable close. It will be observed that diplomacy had obtained for Lloyd's only a half interest in its own wreck. The other 50% still belonged to Mr. Eichhauser's company, as King Willem was particular to make clear in his decree, dated from Hetlu, which went on to say, By our Minister of Foreign Affairs we have offered to the King of Great Britain to cede to His Majesty all that which by our decree of the 14th of September 1821 was reserved to the Netherlands, in the bottom in question, and the cargo therein, doing so solely as proof of our friendly feelings toward the Kingdom of Great Britain, and in no wise from a conviction of the right of England to any portion of the said cargo. We have pleased and thought fit, 1. To cede to His Majesty of Great Britain all that which by our decree of the 4th September 1821 was reserved in favor of the kingdom, relative to the cargo of the frigate Lutine. 2. To instruct our Minister of Inland Affairs and the Maritime Department, Walter Stott, to give notice of this our decree, as well as of the cession made on the part of His Majesty of Great Britain to the Society of Lloyd's, to our Chancellor of State, Governor, North Holland, and to the other authorities concerned, as well as to the participators in the undertaking of 1821 in the Netherlands, and to inform them likewise that an English agent will ere long wait upon them in order to make all such arrangements with them as may be deemed advisable for the furtherance of their mutual interests, and our ministers for inland affairs and the Maritime Department are charged with the carrying out of this decree. The members of Lloyd's were hardly better off with the gift of one half a wreck than they were with no wreck at all. Before undertaking any salvage operation, they must come to some kind of understanding with the Upper Strand finder and his partners with respect to expenses and profits. The Dutch, with proverbial caution, were reluctant to scrape acquaintance with the English owners, convinced that in some matter or other this new ownership in the treasure had been unfairly extorted from their government, The Hague. It was not until 1830 that friendly relations were established, and in the meantime Mr. Escheiser had died, leaving his share in the treasure among his legacies. Then negotiations were interrupted by the political events which caused the separation of Belgium from Holland. The people of the Netherlands heartily hated England for her leading part in this partition, and not even the allurement of fishing gold out of the sea could persuade the Dutch adventurers to have anything to do with Lloyd's or anything that smacked of the perfidious English. For a quarter of a century, the wreck of the Lutine was undisturbed. Then, in 1846, two enterprising English divers in need of work, Hill and Downes by name, conceived an audacious scheme to enrich themselves. They drew up a petition to the King of the Netherlands, asking that they be permitted to pick up as much gold as they could lay hands on among the timbers of the Lutine. Surprising as was this request, it was not refused. According to custom, the petition was carefully examined at The Hague, and the discovery was gravely announced that there was no legal obstacle in the way of the divers or anyone else who cared to seek for the Lutine's treasure. One of the articles of a new code of maritime law passed by the States General of the Netherlands in 1838 provided that the salvage of vessels wrecked on the outer banks of the coast was thrown open to all persons under stipulated conditions, and that the wreck of the Lutine came within this act. The government formally notified Hill and Downes that while the right of salvage could not be granted to any particular person, the ground was free on condition that one half of all that might be found must be given up to Lloyd's. The divers may have found some other employment by this time, for they appeared not at the wreck, but the publication of the proceedings awoke the old Dutch company formed by the Upper Strand finder, and they opened negotiations with the Committee of Lloyd's. No one concerned seemed to be in a hurry to find the several $1,000,000 remaining in the Lutine, and 9 more years dragged past before a working agreement was signed between the two parties. The Dutch company undertook to carry on the work of salvage, paying over one half the gross proceeds to Lloyd's. It was in 1857 that the Dutch went to work, and after a month of exploration the Secretary of Lloyd's received this pleasing information from his agent at the Texel. I feel most happy to inform you that the new efforts to save the value out of the Lutine have not been without success. Yesterday there was recovered by means of divers and pinchers 13 silver coins, being Spanish piastres, 1 gold louis d'or, 5 brass hoops and casks, and a quantity of cannon and shot. Considering the value of the saved objects, it may not be of much signification, but the salvage itself is of very great importance, as it proves 2 facts, namely, first, that the wreck of the Lutine has really been found, and secondly, that there is specie still in the wreck. As soon as anything more is picked up, I will inform you immediately thereof. Be assured I have taken the necessary steps to secure the interest of Lloyd's Committee, as owners of the treasure, which we hope may entirely be saved. A little later, the wreck was found to be very little scattered, and its precise location was determined. The news of the discovered gold wreck spread among the fishermen of the Zuyder Zee and the German Ocean, and they winged it to the scene until there were 68 large and well-manned boats in the immediate neighborhood looking for plunder. At this threatening mobilization, the Dutch government thought it wise to send a gunboat with a party of soldiers on board. In the summer of 1858, the divers brought to the surface the bell of the frigate, which now rests in the committee room of Lloyd's with the other relics. The Lutine had been one of the crack ships of the French Navy and was captured by Admiral Duncan, he who sent her to her doom. The bell bears on its bronze side the royal crown and arms of Bourbon, and on the rim the name of St. Jean, under whose protection the ship and her crew had been placed when she was launched as a fighting frigate of His Majesty Louis XVI of France. The treasure-seeking was continued for several years, whenever the treacherous sea permitted, until, at length, a great gale out of the northwest closed the channel near the wreck and covered her deeper under the sands. The work was finally abandoned by these salvors in 1861. They have forwarded to England for the benefit of Lloyd's a total amount of £22,162 to show that the undertaking had been worthwhile. In the Act of Incorporation of Lloyd's granted by Parliament in 1871, the treasure recovered, as well as that still left in the wreck, was carefully referred to, and it was stated that the Society may from time to time do or join in doing all such lawful things as they think expedient, with a view to further salving from the wreck of the Lutine. It seems rather extraordinary that the exact amount of the treasure lost in the frigate should be a matter of conjecture, and that the records of Lloyd's throw no light on this point. The explanation is that only part of the precious cargo was insured by the underwriters then doing business in the Royal Exchange Building, and that a large amount of gold coin and bullion was hastily forwarded to the Lutine by diverse bankers and merchants shortly before sailing. The records of these consignments were, of course, scattered and have long since been lost. The total amount lost has been quite accurately calculated by employing the system of accounting devised by the Upper Strand finder. His theory was verified by later undertakings at the wreck, and the sequence of letters and numbers stamped upon the gold and silver bars were found to run in regular order, so that it has been latterly assumed that in all 1,000 of these were in the ship's hold. The figures accepted by the Dutch partners in the enterprise, endorsed by Mr. John Maver Hill, the agent of Lloyd's at Amsterdam, were as follows. Salvage in the years 1800 and 1801, 55,770 pounds. Salvage in the years 1857 and 1858, 39,203. Salvage in the years 1859 to 1861, 4,920. Total salvage, 99,893 pounds. Total treasure estimated to have been lost, 1,175,000 pounds. Treasure remaining in the wreck, 1,076,107 pounds. It is plausible to assume, therefore, that more than $5 million in gold and silver are still buried in the sands of the island beach at the entrance of the Zuyder Zee, and that at any time strong gales and shifting currents may once more uncover the bones of the ill-fated Lutine frigate. The members of Lloyd's are daily reminded by the presence of the massive oaken table and chair and the silent ship's bell in the committee room of the princely fortune that is theirs, if they can find it. The story is a romance of maritime insurance, and the end has not yet been written. For with modern equipment and ingenuity, those gold and silver bars, Spanish pistols, louis d'ors, may someday be carried up the staircase of Lloyd's to enrich a corporation of the 20th century. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 12. The Toilers of the Thetis. The Lutine was not the only treasure-laden frigate lost by the British Navy. The circumstances of the wreck of the Thetis in 1830 are notable, not so much for the gold and silver that went down in her, as for the heroic courage and bulldog persistence of the men who toiled to recover the treasure. Their battle against odds was an epic in the annals of salvage. They were treasure-seekers whose deeds, forgotten by this generation, and grudgingly rewarded by their own, were highly worthy of the best traditions of their flag and their race. On the morning of December 4th of the year mentioned, the 46-gun frigate Thetis, with a complement of 300 men, sailed from Rio de Janeiro, homeward bound. As a favor to various merchants of the South American coast who were fearful of the pirates that still lurked in the West Indies, her captain had taken on board for consignment to London a total amount of $810,000 in gold and silver bars. During the evening of the second night at sea, the ship was running at 10.5 knots, with studding sails set and plenty of offing by the reckoning of the deck officers. The lookout stationed on the cathead had no more than bellowed, "Breakers under the bow," when his comrade echoed it with, "Rocks above the masthead." An instant later, the soaring bowsprit of the frigate splintered with a tremendous crash against the sheer cliffs of Cape Frio. The charging vessel fetched up all standing. Her hull had not touched bottom, and there was nothing to check her enormous momentum. In a twinkling, literally in the space of a few seconds, her 3 masts were ripped out and fell on deck with all their hamper, killing and wounding many of the crew. Instead of that most beautiful sight in all the world, a ship under full sail and running free, there was a helpless hulk pounding out her life against the perpendicular wall of rock. The catastrophe befell so suddenly that when Captain Burgess rushed from his cabin at the warning shout, the mast tumbled just as he reached the quarter-deck.
No description can realize the awful state of the ill-fated ship and all aboard at this appalling moment. The night was rainy and so dark that it was impossible to ascertain their position, beyond the fact of their being repeatedly driven with tremendous force against cliffs of a stupendous height above them, and consequently inaccessible, and not offering the slightest chance of escape. The upper deck of the ship, The only part in which exertion could be useful was completely choked up with masts, sails, and rigging, which presented obstacles that rendered unavailing every attempt at active exertion, while the ears of all, who were of course using their utmost endeavors for the general safety, were pierced by the cries of the dying and wounded for the assistance which the imperious calls of duty forbade them to give. Nothing but inevitable destruction presented itself to all on board, and their perfectly helpless state rendered all deliberation useless. And indeed there was no choice of measures, no point on which to offer an opinion, and it could only await such means as Providence might present.
As by a miracle, the bowsprit and yard arms had so checked the speed of the frigate, acting as a sort of buffer, that her hull was not smashed like an eggshell, but was found to be fairly tight. All of the boats had been smashed by the falling spars, and the wretched company could only hang fast and pray that the wreck might float until daylight. But the hammering seas soon caused her to leak through yawning seams, and despairing of keeping her from sinking, a few of the crew managed to reach a shelving projection of rock about 20 feet above the deck. It was a forlorn hope, so perilous to attempt that many of those who scrambled for a foothold fell between the ship and the cliff, and were drowned or crushed to death. Presently the hulk swung away from the face of the cliff and was driven a distance of 1/3 of a mile along the coast and into a tiny cove or notch in the bold headlands of Cape Frio. Here she remained, now sinking very fast. The party who had succeeded in making a landing on the ledge clawed their way to the rescue, following the drifting ship, and with the hardihood and agility of British tars of the old breed, they made their way down the declivity like so many cats, and succeeded in making fast to a rope thrown by their comrades on board. By this means several men had been hauled to safety when the dying frigate lurched wildly and parted the hawser. It was discovered that she now rested on the bottom. Part of the port bulwark, the hammock nettings, the taffrail, and the stumps of the mast remained above water, and to these the crew clung while the surf roared over their heads and threatened to tear them away. The situation was now hopeless, indeed, but all left alive on board were saved by the daring and strength of one man, Boatswain Geach. He fought his way through the breakers to the stump of the bowsprit, lashed himself there, and succeeded in passing a line to his comrades on shore. A strong rope was then hauled up, and one by one the men on board were slung to safety upon the cliffs. Almost all the survivors were dreadfully bruised and lacerated. When the news reached Rio de Janeiro, the British sloop-of-war Lightning was in that port, and her commander, Captain Thomas Dickinson, was the sort of man who likes nothing better than to lead a forlorn hope and grapple with difficulties. Said he,
"The consternation occasioned by the dreadful catastrophe was not confined to naval persons, but was universally felt at Rio, particularly among mercantile people, since from the tenor of the letter and the description given by the officer who brought it, the ship and everything she contained were considered as totally lost. The event became a matter of general conversation, but while everyone deplored it, I did not hear of any who seemed disposed to venture on an attempt to recover the property, all appearing to consider the case as perfectly hopeless. Here was an undertaking which, if successful, would assuredly lead to professional reputation and fortune, but which everyone whom I addressed on the subject thought must fail. Still, the scarcity of the opportunities of obtaining distinction and credit by an extraordinary act of duty, which present themselves to officers in these piping times of peace, offered a consideration which prevailed, and I determined on making the attempt, if I could get orders from the commander-in-chief to that effect."
The admiral of the station proceeded to Cape Frio with a squadron of 5 vessels, and after a careful study of the situation of the wreck concluded that it would be futile to try to recover any of the sunken treasure. In the face of this verdict, Captain Dickinson felt reluctant to press his own views, but the bee in his bonnet would not be denied.
Actuated, however, by the same feelings which had at first prompted me to hazard the attempt, and having a natural repugnance to receding after having, during my inquiries, disclosed my views very freely, I was resolved to persevere. During the absence of the commander-in-chief, I constantly employed myself in inquiring for any persons likely to assist me, searching for implements, and obtaining all the information within my reach, and devised several instruments of minor importance, which appeared likely to be useful. On his return from Cape Frio, I showed these to him, of the whole of which he approved.
Captain Dickinson could find no diving bell in Rio, so this versatile officer proceeded to make one, and an extraordinary contrivance it was, for men to risk their lives in, at the bottom of the sea. From His Majesty's ship Warspite, one of the squadron in harbor, he obtained 2 iron water tanks. These were turned over to an English mechanic named Moore, formerly employed by the Brazilian government, who was assisted by the carpenter of the Lightning. Between them, they fashioned the water tanks into something that looked like a diving bell. These capable artisans then built an air pump, and now they were shy of hose through which to force air to the submerged toilers.
Being unable to find a workman in Rio de Janeiro who would undertake to make an airtight hose, explains Captain Dickinson, there appeared for a time to be a stop to my preparations. But recollecting that there was a Truscott's pump on board the Lightning, I attempted to render the hoses belonging to it fit for the purpose, and to my great delight succeeded, by first beating them hard with a broad-faced hammer to render the texture as close as possible, then giving them a good coat of Stockholm tar. Afterwards parceling them well with new canvas saturated with the same material, and finally serving them with 3 yarn-spun yarns, made of new yarns and well twisted. Having thus surmounted without assistance the 2 most formidable difficulties that had yet presented themselves, I entertained a hope that my own resources would prove equally available on future occasions, and hence my confidence in ultimate success increased, in the event of the stores and treasures still remaining where the ship was lost. My officers and crew likewise now began to feel a great interest in all that was doing, and their conduct and expressions afforded me a happy presage that their future exertions would fulfill my most sanguine expectations. I could not but feel the same encouragement was not afforded by some from whom I had most reason to expect both it and assistance, for although I had now been for 6 weeks engaged in work, drudging on in the double capacity of carpenter and blacksmith, I had not a single voluntary offer by them of any article that might be useful to me. Nor was the kindness of my friends very encouraging, for they almost universally endeavored to dissuade me from venturing on an enterprise which every one considered hopeless, to all of which remonstrances my only reply was that my mind was made up, and that I should not withdraw from it.
The Lightning sailed to begin operations at Cape Frio on the 24th of January, 1831, with a Brazilian launch in tow, and Lutine, a French frigate, in company, going to visit the place as a matter of curiosity. At the scene of the wreck were found the sloop of war Algerine, a schooner as tender, and a complement from the Warspite, which were engaged in saving such stores and spars as had drifted ashore. The theater of Captain Dickinson's ambition as a treasure seeker was hostile and forbidding, a coast on which it seemed impossible to tarry except in the most favorable weather, as he describes it.
The island of Cape Frio is about 3 miles long and 1 in breadth, is the southeastern extremity of Brazil, and separated from the mainland by a narrow strait or gut, about 400 feet broad, having very deep water in it, and through which, the land on each side being very high, the wind constantly rushes in heavy gusts, and a rapid current runs. This island is entirely mountainous, and nearly covered with an almost impenetrable forest, and the whole coast on the seaside of it is formed by precipitous cliffs, washed by very deep water close to the shore, and on the harbor side, with the exception of a sandy bay, is very steep and rugged.
The little notch in the seaward cliffs into which the frigate had been driven was named Thetis Cove by Captain Dickinson, who explored it vainly for traces of the wrecked hull. Either she had been washed out into deep water, or had entirely broken up. 2 months had passed since the disaster, and the only way of trying to find the remains of the vessel was by means of sounding with the hand lead until the diving bell could be rigged. The depth of water ranged from 36 to 70 feet at the base of the cliffs. This cove was an extraordinarily difficult place to work in, there being no beach, and the ramparts of rock towering straight from the water to heights of from 100 to 200 feet. Said Captain Dickinson,
On viewing this terrific place, with the knowledge that at the time of the shipwreck the wind was from the southward, I was struck with astonishment, and it appeared quite a mystery that so great a number of lives could have been saved, and indeed it will never cease to be so, for that part at which the crew landed is so difficult of access, that even in fine weather, after being placed by a boat on the rock at the base, it required considerable strength and agility, with the assistance of a man-rope, to climb the precipitous face of the cliff, and I am certain that in the hour of extreme peril, when excessive exertion was called forth, there must have been a most extraordinary display of it by a few for the benefit of the whole.
Now, this makeshift diving bell of his had to be suspended from something in order to be raised and lowered, but neither his own ship, the Lightning, nor any of the other vessels of the salvage fleet could be anchored in the cove to serve the purpose, because of the grave danger of being caught on a lee shore. At first, Captain Dickinson planned to stretch a cable between the cliffs on either side of the cove, but this was found to be impracticable. Thereupon he proceeded to fashion a huge derrick from which the diving bell should hang like a sinker at the end of a fishing rod. There was no timber on the cape that was fit to be worked up by the ship carpenters, but these worthies, Mr. Bad of the Warspit, and Mr. Daniel Jones of the Lightning, were not to be daunted by such a trifling matter as this. If a derrick was needed, they were the men to make it out of nothing. What they did was to assemble the broken masts and spars that had drifted ashore from the wreck of the Thetis, and patch them together into one immense derrick arm, which with its gear weighed as much as 40 tons. It was a masterpiece of ingenuity and seamanship of the old-fashioned school, such as can no longer be found in navies. This breed of handy man at sea belonged with the vanished age of masts and canvas, wooden walls.
Our encampment and the adjacent parts of the island now presented a bustling and, I flattered myself, a rather interesting scene, wrote the commander. There were parties of carpenters building the derrick, making, carrying to the selected situations, and placing the securities for supporting and working it. Riggers were preparing the gear for it, sawyers cutting wood for various purposes, rope makers making lashings and seizing stuff from the pieces of cable crept up from the bottom, and 2 sets of blacksmiths at their forges, those of the Warspit making hoops, bolts, nails from various articles which had been crept up, and those of the Lightning reducing the large diving bell and constructing a smaller one. 5 gangs of excavators leveling platforms on the heights above the cove, cutting roads to lead to them, and fixing bolts in numerous parts of the faces of the cliffs. Some were employed in felling trees and cutting grass for the huts, while others were building and thatching them. Water carriers were passing to and from the pool with breakers of water, and the officers were attending to the different parties assigned to them for their immediate guidance.
When ready to be placed in position, this derrick, built of odds and ends, was an enormous spar 158 feet long. To support it over the water, elaborate devices had to be rigged from the cliff overhead, and the whole story of this achievement, as related by Captain Dickinson, reads like such a masterful, almost titanic battle against odds that it seems worthwhile quoting at some length.
We had by this time taken off 13 feet of the peak of the northeast cliff, and thereby made a platform of 80 feet by 60. On this was placed the Lightning's capstan and 4 crabs, formed of the heels of the Thetis's topmasts, the Lightning's bower and stream anchors, and the store anchor, to which was shackled the chain splicing tails and several links of the Thetis's chain stream cable, which we had recovered, extending several fathoms over the cliff to attach to the standing parts of the topping lifts and guy topping lifts, too, and preserve them from chafing against the rocks. There were also 8 large bollards, placed in proper positions for other securities. 4 other platforms, each large enough for working a crab, were made at appropriate parts for using the guys and guy topping lifts. The roads and paths had been cut, extending from our encampment to those platforms, and from the one to the other of them together amounted to the length of nearly 1.5 miles. The zigzag path down the cliff was finished, and at those parts of the main cliff which were inaccessible in this manner, rope ladders were substituted, and thus a communication was formed with the cove at the point where the derrick was to be stepped. All this being done, the large hawsers were rove through the blocks, their purchases lashed to them, and partially overhauled over the cliffs. The getting the before-mentioned heavy articles up was most distressingly laborious, for they were obliged to be carried a greater part of the distance where the surface was covered with a deep, loose sand, and to this cause may be mainly attributed a complaint of the heart, which subsequently attacked several of the people. The derrick, which was now composed of 22 pieces, united by a great number of dowels and bolts, 34 hoops, and numerous wouldings of 4-inch ropes, was finished on the evening of the 7th, and the clothing fitted on, and I now had arrived at a point which required much foresight and prearrangement, namely, the preparation for erecting it, and it was necessary to weigh with coolness and circumspection the mode by which this was to be done.
A party of about 60 of our best hands were employed in getting the Lightning's chain and hempen stream cables and large hawsers passed over and around the faces of the cliffs, and the purchases were sufficiently overhauled to admit of their reaching the derrick, and the falls brought to the capstan and crabs, ready for heaving it up. All who are well acquainted with the character and manners of sailors know that it is no easy matter to rid them of their habitual heedlessness. I endeavored to impress them with the need of caution, and the almost universal answer I got was, "Never fear, sir," which from the fearless and careless manner in which it was expressed was by no means calculated to remove my apprehensions for their safety. The task we had now in hand was one of much danger. The parties working over the cliffs were some of them slung in bights of rope, some supported by man-ropes, some assisting each other by joining hands, and others holding by the uncertain tenure of a tuft of grass or a twig, while loose fragments of rock, being disturbed by the gear and by the men who were working on the upper part, were precipitated amidst those below, while the sharp crags lacerated the hands and feet and rendered dodging these dangers extremely difficult. However, by great attention on the part of the officers, and by promptitude in giving aid when required, this very arduous part of our work was performed, which I sincerely believe could not have been accomplished by any men in the world but British seamen, the only accidents being some cuts in the hands and feet, and bruises from falling stones. All the gear being prepared, in the evening I arranged the distribution of my officers with their particular parties at the capstan, crabs, purchases, etc. The smallness of the number of hands sent from the Warspite rendered it necessary that I should have every working man from the Lightning, and on this occasion she was left with only a few convalescents to take care of her, and even the young gentlemen were obliged to give their aid at the capstan. On the morning of the 9th, the derrick was launched without casualty, and while the boats were towing it to the cove, all gear was got ready to be attached to it the moment it arrived at the proper position, according to the plan I had given. It had to be towed for a distance of about a mile, subject to the influence of a strong current running westward through the gut, at once exposing us to the twofold danger of being driven to the sea or against the rocks. In apprehension of accident from one or the other of these causes, I had taken precaution of placing bolts at several points of the rocks, so that in case of necessity a warp might be made fast. However, the derrick reached the cove without disaster, and as everything depended on promptitude of action, I had all the gear fitted to go with toggles, which somewhat facilitated the rigging, that in 1 hour and a half after its arrival everything was in place, and the Lightning's chain stream cable being made fast to the heel of the derrick, ready for heaving up, I left the further management in the cove to Mr. Chatfield, and placed myself upon the main cliff. I then gave the order to heave round, and every one was on the alert, but we had scarcely brought any considerable strain on the gear when a report came to me that the heel of the derrick was displaced and driven into a chasm at the foot of the cliff, an accident which for this time put an end to further efforts. I had no alternative but to cast everything off in a hurry, and if possible return to the harbor with the derrick, but this had become exceedingly doubtful, for the wind was much increased since morning, and the current more rapid. We repeatedly succeeded in towing the derrick into the gut, and were as often driven back, till at length we were compelled to make it fast to the rock outside, until a small anchor and some grapnels were laid out, by which means it was finally warped into the harbor, and by 11:30 at night moored near the Adelaide. Undismayed by this failure, by 7 o'clock of the following morning we were again in the cove with the derrick. The vast weight, the great height of the purchases, the number of them, and the great distances they were apart, made united effort impossible. But at the close of the day I had the satisfaction of seeing this huge spar in the place assigned for it, and the head of it hove 10 feet above the water. On the 11th we were again at our purchases, and the head of the derrick was raised to the angle I had intended, being about 50 feet above the surface of the sea. During the operation of erecting the derrick, it showed great pliability, the result of being composed of so many pieces, which obliged us to get numerous additional guys on, and having thus secured it, we returned to our encampment, all hands greatly fatigued by 3 days of the most harassing exertion, from 4:30 in the morning until late at night. On looking down from the precipice on this enormous machine, with all its necessary rigging, it became a matter of astonishment to myself, and I believe to every one else who saw it, that with the small means we had, we could have succeeded in such a situation. It has been my lot to witness many circumstances in which there was cause for great solicitude, but never one wherein such general anxiety was manifested as on this occasion. If any one thing had given way, it must have been fatal to the whole. A general crash would have been inevitable. Meanwhile, Captain Dickinson had found time to devise a small diving bell made from another water tank, which could be operated from spars and tackle set up on board a launch. This was employed for exploring the bottom of the cove in order to find where the treasure was. The bell held 2 men, and there were plenty of volunteers to risk their lives in the first descent in this little iron pot. The trip was disastrous, and the commander described it as follows. The water happened to be particularly clear, which gave me an indistinct sight of the bell at the depth of 8 fathoms, and I had been watching it with breathless anxiety for a long time, when suddenly a small line of air bubbles rose from about the middle of the hose. I instantly gave the word to the men in the launch to make ready to haul away, but the 2 men in the bell made no signal to be pulled up. The agitation of the sea became greater every minute, and there was a rise and fall of 8 or 10 feet of surf against the cliffs. The danger was increasing, and I was about to order the bell to be raised, when an immense column of air came bursting up from it. It had been driven violently against the rocks, thrown on its side, and filled with water. The next moment I saw the 2 men emerge from the bell and swim to the surface. Haynes had been entangled in the signal line, but he managed to release himself, and Dewar bobbed up a few seconds later. They were too exhausted to say much, but Haynes called to his partner, "Never mind, mate. We haven't done with the damn thing yet." These plucky seamen went down again and discovered considerable wreckage of the lost frigate. The Brazilian colonel with a gang of native Indian divers now appeared on the scene, with a great deal of brag about their ability to find the treasure without any apparatus. They proved to be pestering nuisances who accomplished nothing and were sent about their business after several futile attempts under water. They furnished one jest, however, which helped to lighten the toil. The bell was being lowered when one of these natives, or caboclos, slid over the side of the boat and disappeared in the green depths. In a few seconds the signal came from the bell to hoist up. Fearing trouble, the helpers hoisted lustily, and as the bell approached the surface, something of a brownish hue was seen hanging to its bottom, which was presently discovered to be the caboclo who had tried to enter the bell. The men mistook him for an evil spirit or some kind of sea monster and kicked him back into the water outside, and he can only hang on by the footrail, with his head inside the bell. The first encouraging tidings was signaled from the small diving bell on March 27th, when a bit of board floated up from the submerged men with these words written upon it: "Careful in lowering the bell to a foot, for we are now over some dollars." Soon they came up from 7 fathoms down with their caps full of silver dollars and some gold. Captain Dickinson decided to push the search night and day, and the boats were therefore equipped with torches. It was a spirited and romantic scene, as he describes it. Thetis Cove would have supplied a fine subject for an artist. The red glare cast from the torches on every projection of the stupendous cliffs rendered the deep shadows of their fissures and indentations more conspicuous. The rushing of a roaring sea into the deep chasms produced a succession of reports like those of cannon, and the assembled boats, flashing in and out of the gloom, were kept in constant motion by the long swell. The experiment succeeded to admiration, and we continued taking up treasure until 2 o'clock of the morning of the 1st of April, when we were glad to retire, having obtained in the whole by this attempt $6,326, 36 pounds, 10 ounces of plata pinna, 5 pounds, 4 ounces of old silver, 243 pounds, 8 ounces of silver in bars, and 4 pounds, 8 ounces of gold. After a little rest, we were again at our employment by 5:30, and proceeded very prosperously for some hours, and then had to desist because of a dangerous shift of wind. As soon as the larger bell and the giant derrick could be put in service, the happy task of fishing up treasure was carried on at a great pace. Unlike many other such expeditions, nothing was done at haphazard. The toilers under water were first to go to the outermost dollar or other article of gold they could discover, and to place the pig of ballast, with a bright tally board fast to it, against and on the inner side of the nearest fixed rock they could find. From this they were then to proceed to take up all that lay immediately on the surface of the bottom, but not to remove anything else until all that was visible was obtained. This being done, they were to return to the place first searched, and passing over the same ground, remove the small rocks and other articles one by one, and progressively take up what might be recovered by such removal, but not on any account to dig, without express orders from me. Life in the camp on Cape Frio had no holiday flavor, and while there was continual danger afloat, there were troubles and hardships on shore. In addition to our sufferings from the wind and rain penetrating our flimsy huts, we were attacked by myriads of tormentors in the shape of ants, mosquitoes, fleas, and worst of all, jiggers. Many of the people frequently had their eyes entirely closed from the stings of the mosquitoes. At night swarms of fleas assailed us in our beds, while at day it afforded a kind of amusement to pull up the leg of one's trousers and see them take flight like a flock of sparrows from a corn stack, while there might be 100 congregated inside the stocking. Those little insidious devils, the jiggers, penetrated the skin in almost all parts of the body, forming a round ball and causing sores, which, being irritated by the sand, became most painful and troublesome ulcers, and produced lameness to half our number at a time. Snakes are so numerous that the thatching and almost every nook of our huts was infested with them. They were often found in the people's hammocks and clothes, and several were caught on board the ship. On one occasion my clerk's assistant was writing in his hut when a rustling in the overhanging growth caused him to look up and discover a huge snake, its head extending several feet inside the hole that served as a window. He alarmed the camp, and muskets, cutlasses, sticks, and every other weapon were caught up. The snake escaped, but I received numerous reports of his extraordinary dimensions. My steward insisted that it was as big around as his thigh. The sentry said it was as big as the Lightning's bower cable, and as to length the statements varied between 20 and 30 feet. At another time, Mr. Button, the boatswain, went into the store, in which there was no window, to get a piece of rope. Going in from the glare of the sun, the place appeared dark to him, and he laid hold of what he thought was a length of rope, pulled lustily at it, and was not undeceived until it was dragged out into the light. Then he was horror-struck to find he had hold of a large snake. In May, Captain Dickinson was able to send it to England in His Majesty's ship Eden, treasure to the handsome amount of $130,000 in bullion and specie, and had every promise of recovering most of the remainder of the precious cargo. Then a terrific storm swept the cove, totally demolished the derrick, carried the large diving bell to the bottom, and made hash of the whole equipment devised with such immense toil and pains. Was he discouraged? Not a bit of it. He straightway set his men at work to construct new apparatus, with which he fetched up more gold and silver to the value of $500,000 before he forsook the task. First, let him tell you in his own words of that tragic storm and its results. At 1 o'clock of the morning of May 19th, it blew a perfect gale. The cove was in a far more disturbed state than I had ever seen it before. The seas rolled up the cliff to an astonishing height, and by daylight the cove was in a state of awful commotion. The spray was driven so wildly that while standing on the main platform at an elevation of 155 feet, I was completely wet and could scarcely resist it. The waves struck the derrick with steadily increasing force, and I watched it with all the distressing feelings that a father would evince toward a favorite child when in a situation of great danger. By 6 o'clock the wind threw the waves obliquely against the southeast cliff, and caused them to sweep along its whole length, until opposed by the opposite cliff, from which, as each wave recoiled, it was met by the following one, and thus accumulated, they rose in one vast heap under the derrick stage, beat it from under the bell, and washed away the air pump, air hoses, and semaphore. The stage was suspended at a height of 38 feet above the surface of the sea in ordinary weather, from which circumstances an idea may be formed of the furious agitation of the cove. 9 o'clock arrived, and I had been watching for 14 hours. The constant concussions had caused the gear of the derrick to stretch. Every blow from the sea caused it to swing and buckle to an alarming degree. Nothing more could possibly be done to save it, and I saw plainly that unless the gale soon ceased, its destruction was inevitable. I therefore left an officer on watch, and quitted the cliff to go to my hut and arrange my parties for the work to be put in, and after the catastrophe. Presently he came down to meet me, and reported that a stupendous roller had struck the derrick on its side, and broke it off 20 feet from the heel. Thus in one crash was destroyed the child of my hopes, and in a very short time the derrick was dashed into 6 pieces, forming, with the complicated gear, one confused mass of wreckage. Before the storm had subsided, the indefatigable seamen, blacksmiths, and carpenters were solving the problem afresh, just as if there had not been a clean sweep of their weary months of effort. This time it was a new scheme for a suspension cable that had occurred to Captain Dickinson. While this work was in progress, he made another diving bell from a water tank, and succeeded in finding his air pump at the bottom of the cove. 2 men were drowned in the surf at this stage of operations, the only fatality suffered by the heroic company. The diving bell was successfully slung from the suspended cable after a vast deal of ingenious and daring engineering, and by means of it much treasure was recovered, although the contrivance yawed fearfully under water and more than once capsized and spilled its crew. fought their gasping way to the surface. After 14 months of incessant toil, the men and officers, worn to the bone and ravaged by fever and dysentery, they had found almost $600,000 in bullion and specie, or 3/4 of the total amount lost in the Thetis. It had been magnificently successful salvage, achieved in the face of odds that would have disheartened a less resourceful and courageous commander than Captain Thomas Dickinson. He appears to have been the man in 1,000 for the undertaking. Then occurred an inexplicable sort of a disappointment, an act of such gross injustice to him that can be explained only on the theory of favoritism at naval headquarters. Captain Dickinson had a grievance, and he describes the beginning of his troubles in this fashion. On the 7th and 8th of March, some more treasure was found in a part from which we have removed several guns, and here I had determined to have a thorough examination by digging, feeling assured that here would be found all the remaining treasure that could be obtained. Our labors were drawing to a close, but while I was enjoying the pleasing anticipation of a speedy and successful termination of the enterprise, on the 6th I was surprised by the arrival of His Majesty's sloop Algerine, with orders from the Commander-in-Chief to me to resign the charge to Commander the Honorable J.F.F. de Roos of that sloop. It appears that the Admiralty had been led to think that no more property could be rescued, and therefore ordered my removal. I could not but feel this a most mortifying circumstance. I had been the only person who had come forward to attempt the recovery of the large property which was considered to be irretrievably lost. I had devised the whole of the methods by which a very large portion of it was recovered. I had endured peril, sickness, toil, and privation during more than a year, and the work was now reduced to a mere plaything compared with what it had been, and yet I was not allowed to put the finishing hand to it. Notwithstanding this, the deep interest I felt in the undertaking remained unabated, and I was determined that nothing should be wanting on my part to ensure a successful termination of it. Quite courteously, Captain Dickinson explained in detail to Commander the Honorable J.F.F. de Roos the plan and the operations. It even left for him to fish up a large quantity of treasure already located, and which could be scooped up from the diving bell without difficulty. With a feeling which I thought would be appreciated by a brother officer, I did not attempt to bring up this treasure, but left it for the benefit of our successors, observing at the time that the world should not say that I had left them nothing to do but the labor of removing rocks and rubbish. The amount subsequently recovered by the Algerine was $161,500, so that by Captain Dickinson's efforts and the use of his plans and equipment, all but 1/16 of the lost treasure was restored to its owners, and of this he himself had raised by far the greater part. When he returned to England and learned that the salvage was to be awarded to the officers and men who had been engaged in the work, he naturally regarded himself as the principal salver. The Admiralty, in its inscrutable wisdom, chose to think otherwise, and the underwriters of Lloyd's, taking their cue from this exalted quarter, regarded poor Captain Dickinson with the cold and fishy eye of disfavor. The case was argued in the Court of Admiralty, and the agents of Admiral Baker, he who had been in command of the squadron at Rio, set up the claim that he was the principal salver, although the fact was plain that he had nothing whatever to do with recovering the treasure from the Thetis, and not even visited Cape Frio during the year of active operations. The judge could not stomach such a high-handed claim as this, and his decision set aside the admiral in favor of Captain Dickinson and the crew of the Lightning. The salvage award, however, amounting to £17,000, was decreed as due also to the company of the Algerine, numbering almost 400 men, which left small pickings for Captain Dickinson and his heroes. This was so obviously unfair that he appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which increased the award by the sum of £12,000, in which Commander the Honorable J.F.F. de Roos and his belated treasure-seekers were not entitled to share. The influential Committee of Lloyd's thought that Captain Dickinson should not have been so bumptious in defending his rights, and because he disagreed with their opinions, they ignored him in a set of resolutions which speak for themselves.
First, a vote of thanks to Admiral Sir Thomas Baker for his zeal and exertions. Second, same to Captain de Roos of the Algerine, and a grant of £2,000 to himself, his officers and crew, being the amount they would have received had they been parties to the appeal. Third, to mark the sense of the meeting of Captain de Roos's conduct, they further voted to this officer a piece of plate to the value of 100 guineas.
In other words, an unimportant naval captain deserved this censure because he had not been content to take what was graciously flung at him by Lloyd's and the Admiralty, but had stood for his rights as long as he had a shot in the locker. There is something almost comic in the figure cut by Commander the Honorable J.F.F. de Roos, who reaped the reward of another man's labors and received the formal thanks of Lloyd's as the chief treasure finder of the Thetis frigate. Captain Thomas Dickinson was a dogged and aggressive sort of person, not in the least afraid of giving offense in high places, and had he not been of this stamp of man, he would never have fought that winning fight against obstacles amid the hostile cliffs and waters of desolate Cape Frio. He shows his mettle in a fine outburst of protest, the provocation for which was a sentence in a letter published in a London newspaper while his case was under discussion. Had Captain Dickinson relied on the liberality of Lloyd's Coffee House, he would not have been a poorer man. This was like a spark in a magazine, and the captain of the Lightning flings back in retort. Here, then, we arrive at the development of the real feelings of the underwriters. Here is exposed the head and front of my offending. Rely on the liberality of Lloyd's Coffee House, so that because I would not abandon my duty to my officers and crew, or separate my interests from theirs, and place myself and them at the mercy of the underwriters, therefore the enterprise and the services of 14 months, besides the rescue of nearly $600,000, are to be considered as utterly unworthy of mention. Can it be necessary, in order to entitle a British officer to honorable mention in Lloyd's Coffee House, that he should abandon a right, and succumbing to the feet of its mighty committee, accept a donation doled out with all the ostentation of a gratuitous liberality, in place of that reward which legally took precedence even of the ownership of the property rescued? End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 13. The Quest of El Dorado. In our time, the golden word El Dorado has come to mean the goal of unattained desires, the magic country of dreams that forever lies just beyond the horizon. Its literal significance has been lost in the mists of the centuries, since, when one deluded band of adventurers after another was exploring unknown regions of the New World in quest of the treasure city hidden somewhere in the remote interior of South America. Thousands of lives and millions of money were vainly squandered in these pilgrimages, but they left behind them one of the most singularly romantic chapters in the whole history of conquest and discovery. The legend of El Dorado was at first inspired by the tales of a wonderful and veritable Dorado, or gilded man, king of a tribe of Indians dwelling, at the time of the Spanish conquest, upon the lofty tableland of Bogota, in what is now the Republic of Colombia. Later investigations have accepted it as true that such a personage existed, and that the ceremonies concerning, which reports were current early in the 16th century, took place at the sacred lake of Guatavia. There lived on this plateau, in what is still known as the province of Cundinamarca, small village communities of the Moisque Indians, somewhat civilized and surrounded on all sides by debased and savage tribes. They worshipped the sun and the moon, performed human sacrifices, and adored striking natural objects, as was the custom in Peru. The numerous lakes of the region were holy places, each regarded as the home of a particular divinity to which gold and emeralds were offered by throwing them into the water. Elsewhere than at Guatavita, jewels and objects wrought of gold have been discovered in the process of draining these little lakes. Guatavita, however, is most famous of all because here originated the story of El Hombre Dorado. This sheet of water is a few miles north of the capital city of Santa Fe de Bogota, more than 9,000 feet above sea level. In the heart of the Cordilleras, near the lake, is still the village called Guatavita. In 1490, the inhabitants were an independent tribe with a ruling chief. They had among them a legend that the wife of one of the earlier chiefs had thrown herself into the lake in order to escape punishment, and that her spirit survived as the goddess of the place. To worship her came the people of other communities of the region, bringing their gold and precious stones to cast into the water, and Guatavita was famed for its religious pilgrimages. Whenever a new chief or king of Guatavita was chosen, an imposing ceremonial was observed by way of coronation. All the men marched to the lake in procession at the head of a great party wailing, the bodies nude and painted with ochre as a sign of deep mourning. Behind them were groups richly decorated with gold and emeralds, their heads adorned with feathers, cloaks of jaguar skins hanging from their shoulders. Many uttered joyful cries or blew on trumpets and conch shells. Then came the priests in long black robes decorated with white crosses. At the rear of the procession were the nobles, escorting the newly elected chief, who rode upon a barrel hung with discs of gold. His naked body was anointed with resinous gums and covered with gold dust, so that he shone like a living statue of gold. This was the gilded man, El Dorado, whose fame traveled to the coast of the Caribbean. At the shore of the lake, he and his escort stepped upon a balsa, or raft made of rushes, and moved slowly out to the middle. There the gilded one plunged into the deep water and washed off his precious covering, while with shouts and music the assembled throng threw their offerings of gold and jewels into the lake.
Then the worshippers returned to the village for dancing and feasting.
In the last decade of the 15th century, or while Columbus was making his voyages, the tribe of Guatavita was conquered by a stronger community of the Moisca race, and the new rulers, being of a thriftier mind, made an end of the extravagant ceremony of El Dorado. It is therefore assumed that the gilded man had ceased to be, full 30 years before the Spaniards first heard of him at the coast. Humboldt became interested in the legend during his South America travels and reported, "I have examined from a geographical point of view the expeditions on the Orinoco, and in a western and southern direction in the eastern side of the Andes, before the tradition of El Dorado was spread among the conquerors. This tradition had its origin in the kingdom of Quito, where Luis Daza, in 1535, met with an Indian of New Granada who had been sent by his prince, the Zipa of Bogota, or the Caique of Tunja, to demand assistance from Atahualpa, the last Inca of Peru. This ambassador boasted, as was usual, of the wealth of his country, but what particularly fixed the attention of the Spaniards who were assembled with Daza was the history of a lord who, his body covered with gold dust, went into a lake amid the mountains. As no historical remembrance attaches itself to any other mountain lake in this vicinity, I suppose the reference to be made to the sacred lake of Guatavita in the plains of the Bogota, into which the gilded lord was made to enter. On the banks of this lake I saw the remains of a staircase hewn in the rock and used for the ceremonies of ablution. The Indians told me that powder of gold and golden vessels were thrown into this lake as a sacrifice to the Adoratorio de Guatavita. Vestiges are still found of a breach made by the Spaniards in order to drain the lake. The ambassador of Bogota, whom Daza met in the kingdom of Quito, had spoken of a country situated towards the east.
The latter reference means that the legend had spread from coast to coast. On the Pacific, the conquistadors of Pizarro were for a time too busily engaged in looting the enormous treasures of the last Inca of Peru to pay much heed to the lure of golden legends beckoning them further inland. The first attempt to go in search of the gilded man and his kingdom was made, not by a Spaniard, but by a German, Ambrosius Dalfinger, who was in command of a colony of his countrymen settled on the shore of the Gulf of Venezuela, a large tract of that region having been leased by Spain to a German company. He pushed inland to the westward as far as the Rio Magdalena, treated the natives with horrible barbarity, and was driven back after losing most of his men.
A few years later, and the legend was magnified into a wondrous description of a golden city. In 1538, there marched from the Atlantic coast Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, surnamed El Conquistador, to find the El Dorado. At the head of 625 foot soldiers and 85 mailed horsemen, he made his perilous way up the Rio Magdalena, through fever-cursed swamps and tribes of hostile natives, enduring hardships almost incredible, until at length he came to the lofty plateau of Bogota, and the former home of the real gilded man. More than 500 of his men had died on the journey of hunger, illness, and exposure. He found rich cities and great stores of gold and jewels, but failed to discover the El Dorado of his dreams. Many stories were afloat of other treasures to be wrested from the Muisca chiefs, but Quesada, having no more than a handful of fighting men, feared to go campaigning until he had made his position secure. He therefore established a base and laid the foundations of the present city of Bogota. One of his scouting parties brought back tidings of a tribe of very warlike women in the south who had much gold. and in this way was the myth of the Amazons linked with the El Dorado as early as 1538. Now occurred as dramatic a coincidence as could be imagined. To Quesada there appeared a Spanish force commanded by Sebastian de
Belalcazar,
conqueror of Quito, who had come all the way from the Pacific coast, after hearing from an Indian of New Granada the story of the Gilded Man. No sooner had this expedition arrived than it was reported to Quesada that white men with horses were coming from the east. This third company of pilgrims in quest of El Dorado proved to be Nicholas Fetterman and his hard-bitted Germans from the colony in Venezuela who had followed the trail made by Dolfinger and then plunged into the wilderness beyond his
furthest outpost.
Thus these three daring expeditions, Quesada from the north,
Belalcazar from the south, and Fetterman from the east,
met face to face on the hitherto unknown plateau in Dinamarca. None had been aware of the other's march in search of this goal, and each had believed himself to be the discoverer of this country. They were ready to fly at one another's throats, for there could be no amity when gold was the prize at stake. Curiously enough, the three forces were evenly matched in fighting strength, each with about 160 men. One might think that the two Spanish parties would have united to drive the Germans from the home of El Dorado, but greed stifled all natural ties and emotions.
A conflict was averted by the tact and sagacity of Quesada
and the priests of the expeditions who acted as a committee of arbitration. It was finally agreed among the leaders that the several claims should be submitted to the Spanish court, and Quesada, Alcazar, and Fetterman set out for Spain to appear in person, leaving their forces in possession of the disputed territory. The command of the Spanish troops was turned over to Hernan Perez de Quesada, cruel and greedy brother of the leader, who fortified himself at Bogota and proceeded to rob the
Muisca people
of the last ounce of gold that could be extorted by means of torture and all manner of unspeakable wickedness. In 1540 he tried to drain the lake of Guadavita, tempted by the stories of the vast treasure of gold and jewels that for centuries had been thrown into the water by the worshippers, but he recovered valuables only to the amount of 4,000 ducats. It was the remains of his drainage tunnel, which Humboldt found and made note of. With the conquest of this region was obtained the last great store of gold discovered by the plundering Spaniards in South America.
These explorers finished what Pizarro had begun in Peru.
To convey the treasure from Bogota to the coast of the Caribbean, a road was built through the mountains, much of it cut as narrow shelf and solid rock, winding and dipping in a dizzy route to connect with the upper reaches of navigation on the Rio Magdalena. This was the famous El Camino Real, or King's Highway, which is still used as one of the roads by which the capital of Colombia, Santa Fe de Bogota, is reached by the traveler of the 20th century. It was to intercept one of these treasure trains that Amyas Leigh and his doughty comrades of Westward Ho lay in wait, and the fiction of Kingsley will better serve to portray the time and place, and the facts as the old historians strung them together.
Bidding farewell once and forever to the green ocean of the eastern plains, they have crossed the Cordillera. They have taken a longing glance at the city of Santa Fe, lying in the midst of rich gardens on its lofty mountain plateau, and have seen, as was to be expected, that it was far too large for any attempt of theirs. But they have not altogether thrown away their time. Their Indian lad has discovered that a gold train is going down from Santa Fe toward the Magdalena, and they are waiting for it beside the miserable rut that serves for a road, encamped in a forest of oaks, which would make them almost fancy themselves back in Europe, were it not for the tree ferns which form the undergrowth, and were it not for the deep gorges opening at their very feet, in which, while their brows are swept by the cool breezes of a temperate zone, they can see far below, dim through their everlasting vapor bath of rank but steam, the mighty forms and gorgeous colors of the tropic forest. At last, up from beneath, there was a sharp crack and a loud cry. The crack was neither the snapping of a branch nor the tapping of a woodpecker. The cry was neither the scream of a parrot nor the howl of a monkey. "That was a whip's crack," said Yo, "and a woman's wail. They are close here, lads." "A woman's? Did they drive women in their gangs?" asked Amyas. "Why not, the brutes? There they are, sir. Did you see their basnets glitter?" "Men," said Amyas in a low voice, "I will trust you all not to shoot till I do. Then give them one arrow, out swords, and at them. Pass the word along." Up they came slowly, and all hearts beat loud at their coming. First about 20 soldiers, only one half of whom were on foot, the other half being borne, incredible as it may seem, each in a chair on the back of a single Indian. while those who marched had consigned their heaviest armor and their arquebuses into the hands of the attendant slaves, who were each pricked on at will by the pikes of the soldiers behind them. Last of this troop came some inferior officer, also in his chair, who, as he went slowly up the hill with his face turned toward the gang which followed, drew every other second the cigar from his lips to inspirit them those pious ejaculations which earned for the pious Spaniards of the 16th century the uncharitable imputation of being the most abominable swearers in Europe. A line of Indians, Negroes, and Zambos, naked and emaciated, scarred with whips and fetters, and chained together by their left wrists, toiled upwards, panting and perspiring under the burden of a basket held up by a strap which passed across their foreheads. Yo's sneer was but too just. There were not only old men and youths among them, but women, slender young girls, mothers with children running at their knee, and at the sight a low murmur of indignation rose from the ambushed Englishmen, worthy of the free and righteous hearts of those days, when Raleigh could appeal to man and God on the ground of a common humanity, in behalf of the outraged heathens of the New World. But the first 40, so Amyas counted, bore on their backs a burden which made all, perhaps but him and Yo, forget even the wretches who bore it. Each basket contained a square package of carefully corded hide, the look whereof friend Amyas knew full well. "What's in they, Captain?" "Gold." And at that magic word all eyes were strained greedily forward, and such a rustle followed that Amyas, in the very face of detection, had to whisper, be men, or you will spoil all yet."
The muskets and longbows of the stout Englishmen avenged the wrongs of this pitiable caravan, although there was no help for the vast multitude of Indians who were put to death with devilish torments by their conquerors. But the legend of the El Dorado still survived, and it spread like an avenging spirit. Transplanted by the overexcited imagination of the white man, the vision appeared like a mirage, enticing, deceiving, and leading men to destruction on the banks of the Orinoco and the Amazon, in Omagua and Parim. The conquest of Bogota made them believe that the gilded man and his golden kingdom were somewhere just beyond. The licensed Tate, Juan de Castellanos, wrote a poem which was published in 1589 telling of the legend as it had existed in Quito in the days of the conquistadors.
When with that foe came Anasco, and Alcazar learned from a stranger then living in the city of Quito, but who called Bogota his home, of a land there rich in golden treasure, rich in emeralds glistening the rock. A chief was there who stripped a vesture, covered with golden dust from crown to toe, sailed with offerings to the gods upon a lake, borne by the waves upon a fragile raft, dark flood brightened with golden light.
Another and more imaginative version of the story was told to Oviedo by diverse Spaniards whom he met in San Domingo. They had heard from Indians in Quito that the great Lord El Dorado always went about covered with powdered gold, because he thought this kind of garment more beautiful and distinguished than any decorations of beaten gold. The lesser chiefs were in the habit of adorning themselves likewise, but were not so lavish as the king, who put on his gold dust every morning and washed it off at night. He first anointed himself with a fragrant liquid gum, to which the gold dust adhered so evenly that he resembled a brilliant piece of artfully hammered gold metal. For more than half a century the mad quest continued, and always there came tragedy and disaster. The German colony of Venezuela was wiped out because of these futile expeditions into the interior. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the great Francisco, set out to find the city of legend, and returned after 2 years, in such dreadful plight that the survivors of the party looked more like wild animals than men, so that one could no longer recognize them. Pedro de Urzúa started from Bogota to find a golden city of the sun, and his expedition founded the town of Pampeluna. In 1560 the same Lear was appointed governor of Magua and El Dorado, and he set out to find his domain by way of the Amazon. Urzúa was murdered by Lope de Aguirre, who treacherously conspired against him, and Aguirre descended the great river and finally reached Venezuela after one of the maddest piratical cruises ever recorded.
Camilla, in A History of the Orinoco, says,
I find it, El Dorado, related with such an exact description of the country as the missionaries of my province and myself have recognized that I cannot doubt it. I have seen in the jurisdiction of Arenas, in the mountains of Pararaca, in 1721, the brass halberd which Urzúa took with him in his expedition. I have been acquainted with Don Joseph Gavarte, who directed for 30 years the missions of
Agrico and the Orinoco.
the countries traversed by Urzúa, and he appeared to be fully persuaded that that was the route to El Dorado. Meanwhile, the myth had assumed new forms. On the southwestern tributaries of the Amazon were the fabled districts of Anam and Patiti, said to have been founded by Incas who had fled from Peru and to have surpassed ancient Cusco in splendor. North of the Amazon, the supposed city of El Dorado moved eastward until in Raleigh's time it was situated in Guyana beside Lake Parima. This lake remained on English maps until the explorations of Schomburg in the 19th century proved that it was nothing more than a pond in a vast swamp. The Emerald Mountain of Espirito Santo and the Matarillos gold mine, long sought for in western Brazil, recalled the El Dorado myth, while far to the southward in the plains of the Argentine city of Caesar, with silver walls and houses, was another alluring and persistent phantom. It was said to have been founded by shipwrecked Spanish sailors, and even late in the 18th century expeditions were sent in search for it. It was not until 1582 that the Spanish ceased to pursue the fatal phantom city of El Dorado, and Southey's History of the Brazils is authority for the statement that these expeditions cost Spain more than all the treasures she had received from her South American possessions. There is more meaning than appears on the surface in the Spanish proverb, "Happiness is only to be found in El Dorado," which no one yet has been able to reach.
Alas, that Sir Walter Raleigh should have been lured to seek in Guyana the fabled El Dorado, which had now become the splendid city of Manoa, built on the shores of a vast inland lake of salt water. It was in this guise that he heard the transplanted and exaggerated story of the Gilded Man. His own narrative, as included in Hakluyt's Voyages, is entitled The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, with a relation of the great and golden city of Manoa, which the Spaniards call El Dorado, and the provinces of Amiria, Aromaya, Amapaya, and other countries, with the rivers adjoining, performed in the year 1595 by Sir Walter Raleigh, Knight, Captain of Her Majesty's Guard, Lord Warden of the Stannaries, and Her Highness's Lieutenant General of the County of Cornwall. It was while touching at the island of Trinidad, outward bound, that Raleigh had the misfortune to learn the story of a picturesque liar by the name of Juan Martinez, derelict Spanish seaman who had sailed with the explorer Diego de Ordaz in 1531. The relation of this Martinez, who was the first that discovered Manoa, his success and end are to be seen in the chancery of St. Juan de Puerto Rico, writes Raleigh,
whereof Barrero had a copy, which appeared to be the greatest encouragement as well to Barrero as to others that formerly attempted the discovery and conquest. Orellana, after he failed of the discovery of Guyana by the said river of the Amazon, passed into Spain, and there obtained a patent of the king for the invasion and conquest, but died by sea about the islands, and his fleet severed by tempest. The action for that time proceeded not. Diego Ordaz followed the enterprise, and departed Spain with 600 soldiers and 30 horse, who, arriving on the coast of Guyana, was slain in mutiny, with the most part of such as favored him, as also of the rebellious part, insomuch as his ships perished, and few or none returned. Neither was it certainly known what became of the said Ordaz, until Barrero found the anchor of his ship in the river of Orinoco, but it was supposed, and so it is written by Lopez, that he perished on the seas, and of other writers diversely conceived and reported. And hereof it came that Martinez entered so far within the land and arrived at that city of Inca, the emperor. For it chanced that while Ordaz with his army rested at the port Moraquito, who was either the first or second that attempted Guyana, by some negligence the whole store of powder provided for the service was set afire. Martinez, having the chief charge, was condemned by the General Ordaz to be executed forthwith. Martinez, being much favored by the soldiers, had all the means possible procured for his life, but it could not be obtained in other sort than this, that he should be set into a canoe alone without any victuals, only his arms, and so turned loose into the great river. But it pleased God that the canoe was carried down the stream, and that certain of the Guyanans met it the same evening, and having not at any time seen any Christian, nor any man of that color, they carried Martinez into the land to be wondered at, and so from town to town until he came to the great city of Manoa, the seat and residence of Inca, the emperor. The emperor, after he had beheld him, knew him to be a Christian, for it was not long before that his brethren Guascar and Atabalpa were vanished by the Spaniards in Peru, and caused him to be lodged in his palace and well entertained. He lived 7 months in Manoa, but was not suffered to wander into the country anywhere. He was also brought thither all the way blindfold, led by the Indians, until he came to the entrance of Manoa itself, and was 14 or 15 days in the passage. He avowed at his death that he entered the city at noon. Then they uncovered his face, and that he traveled all that day till night through the city, and the next day from sun rising to sun setting, ere he came to the palace of Inca. After that, Martinez had lived 7 months in Manoa, and began to understand the language of the country. Inca asked him whether he desired to return into his own country, or would willingly abide with him. But Martinez, not desirous to stay, obtained the favor of Inca to depart, with whom he sent divers Guyanans to conduct him to the river of Orinoco, all laden with as much gold as they could carry, which he gave to Martinez at his departure. But when he was arrived near the river's side, the borderers, which are called Orinocoicapani, robbed him and his Guyanans of all the treasure, the borderers being at that time at war, which Inca had not conquered, save only of 2 great bottles of gourds, which were filled with beads of gold curiously wrought, which those Orinocoicapani thought had been no other thing than his drink or meat, or grain for food, with which Martinez had liberty to pass. And so in canoes he fell down from the river of Orinoco to Trinidad, and from thence to Margarita, and also to St. Juan de Puerto Rico, where remaining a long time for passage into Spain, he died. In the time of his extreme sickness, and when he was without hope of life, receiving the sacrament at the hands of his confessor, he delivered these things with the relation of his travels, and also called for his calabazas, or gourds of the gold beads, which he gave to the church and friars to be prayed for. This Martinez was he that christened the city of Manoa by the name of El Dorado, and as Barrero informed me upon this occasion, those Guyanans, and also the borderers, and all others in that tract which I have seen, are marvelous great drunkards, in which vice I think no nation can compare with them, and at times of their solemn feast, when the emperor carouseth with his captains, tributaries, and governors, the manner is thus. All those that pledge him are first stripped naked, and their bodies anointed all over with a kind of white balsam, by them called curca, of which there is great plenty, and yet very dear amongst them, and it is of all others the most precious, whereof we have good experience. When they are anointed all over, certain servants of the emperor, having prepared gold made into fine powder, blow it through hollow canes upon their naked bodies, until they be all shining from foot to head, and in this sort they sit drinking by 20s and 100s, and continue in drunkenness sometimes 6 or 7 days together. The same is also confirmed by a letter written into Spain, which was intercepted, which Mr. Robert Dudley told me he had seen. Upon this site, and for the abundance of gold which he saw in the city, the images of gold in their temples, plates, armors, and shields of gold, which they used in the wars, he called it El Dorado.
After mentioning in detail the several ill-fated expeditions of the Spanish to find the El Dorado, Raleigh reviews the mass of evidence in favor of the existence of the hidden and magnificent city, and as gravely relates the current reports of other wonders as prodigious as this. He it was who carried back to Europe the story of the Amazons, being very desirous to understand the truth of those warlike women, because of some it is believed, of others not. And although I digress from my purpose, yet I will set down that which hath been delivered me for truth of those women. And I spake with a cacique, or lord of the people, that told me he had been in the river and beyond it. They are said to be very cruel and bloodthirsty, especially to such as offer to invade their territories. These Amazons have likewise great stores of these plates of gold, which they recover chiefly by exchange for a kind of green stones. That the natures of these stern ladies had a softer side is prettily indicated by Raleigh in the statement that in the month of April
all kings of the border assemble and queens of the Amazons, and after the queens have chosen, the rest cast lots for their valentines. This one month they feast, dance, and drink of their wines in abundance, and the moon being done, they all depart to their own provinces.
Among the perils that beset the road to El Dorado was a terrible nation of men with no heads upon their shoulders. Raleigh did not happen to encounter them during his voyage up the Orinoco, but nevertheless he took pains to set down in his narrative,
which though it may be thought a mere fable, yet for mine part I am resolved it is true, because every child in the provinces of Maya and Canuri affirm the same. They are called Iwapanama. They are reported to have their eyes in their shoulders and their mouths in the middle of their breasts, and that a long train of hair groweth backward between their shoulders. The son of Topiawari, which I brought with me into England, told me that they are the most mighty men of all the land, use bows, arrows, clubs, thrice as big as any of Guyana,
or of the Orinoco,
and that one of the Awanawakuri took a prisoner of them the year before our arrival there, and brought him into the borders of Aromaya, his father's country.
and farther when I seem to doubt of it.
He told me that it was no wonder among them, but that they were as great a nation and as common as any other in all the provinces, and had of late years slain many hundreds of his father's people, but it was not my chance to hear of them until I was come away.
And if I had but spoken but one word of it,
While I was there, I might have brought one of them with me to put the matter out of doubt. Such a nation was written of by Mandeville, whose reports were holden for fables many years, and yet since the East Indies were discovered, we find his relations true of all things as
heretofore,
were held incredible.
whether it be true or no,
The matter is not great, neither can there be any profit in the imagination. For my own part, I saw them not, but I am resolved that so many people did not all combine or forethink to make the report. When I came to Comana in the West Indies, afterwards by chance I spake with a Spaniard dwelling not far from thence, a man of great travel, and after he knew that I had been in Guyana,
and so far directly west as Caroli,
the first question he asked me was, whether I had seen any of the Waipanoma, which are those without heads, who being esteemed a most honest man of his word, and in all things else, told me he had seen many of them. That Sir Walter Raleigh, the finest flower of manhood that blossomed in his age, should have believed these and other wonders, does not belittle his fame. He lived and fought and sailed in a world that had not been explored and mapped and charted and photographed and written about until all romance and mystery were driven out of it. The globe had not shrunk to a globule around which excursionists whiz in 40 days on a coupon ticket. Men truly great, endowed with courage and resourcefulness of epic heroes, and the simple faith of little children, were voyaging into unknown seas to find strange lands, ready to die, and right cheerfully for God and their King. Sir Walter Raleigh was bound up heart and soul in winning Guyana as a great empire for England, and when his enemies at home scouted his reports and accused him of trying to deceive the nation with his tales of El Dorado, he replied with convincing sincerity and pathos, "A strange fancy it has been to me to have persuaded my own son, whom I have lost, and to have persuaded my wife to have adventured
the £8,000 which his majesty gave them, Shelbourne,
and when that was spent, to persuade my wife to sell her house in Mitcham in hope of enriching them by the mines of Guyana, if I myself had not seen them with my own eyes. For being old and weakly, 13 years in prison, and not used to the air, to travel and to watching, it being 10 to 1 that I should ever have returned, and of which by reason of my violent sickness, and the long continuance thereof, no man had any hope,
what madness would have made me undertake the journey?
but the assurance of this mind."
He was referring here to his fourth and last voyage in quest of El Dorado. Elizabeth was dead, and James I bore Raleigh no good will. After a long imprisonment, for 13 years under suspended sentence of death, he was permitted to leave the Tower and embark with a fleet of 13 ships in 1617, it being particularly enjoined that he should engage in no hostilities with his dearest enemy, Spain. It is generally believed that King James hoped and expected that such a clash of interests as was almost inevitable in the attempt to plant the English flag in Guyana would give him a pretext to send Raleigh to the headsman's block. It was on this voyage that Raleigh lost his eldest son, besides several of his ships, and utterly failed in the high-hearted purpose of setting up a kingdom whose capital city should be that splendid lost city of Manoa.
He was unable to avoid battles with the insolent Spanish.
It was in one of these that his son was killed, and when he returned to England, the price was exacted and paid. Sir Walter Raleigh was executed in the palace yard at Westminster, and thus perished one who brought great glory to England by land and sea. Concerning El Dorado, Raleigh had given credence to no more than was believed in his time by the Spanish of every port, from San Marta on the Caribbean to Quito on the Pacific. The old chronicles are full of it. One instance, chosen almost at random from many of the same kind, is quoted by de Pons in his History of Caracas. When the wild Indian appeared before the Spanish governor of Guyana, Don Manuel Centurion de Angostura, he was assailed with questions, which he answered with as much perspicuity and precision as could be expected from one whose most intelligible language consisted in signs.
He, however, succeeded in making them understand that there was on the border of Lake Parima a city whose inhabitants were civilized and regularly disciplined to war. He boasted a great deal of the beauty of its buildings, the neatness of its streets, the regularity of its squares, and the riches of its people. According to him, the roofs of its principal houses were either of gold or silver. The high priest, instead of pontifical robes, rubbed his whole body with the fat of the turtle. Then they blew upon it some gold dust, so as to cover his whole body with it. In this attire he performed the religious ceremonies. The Indian sketched on the table with a bit of charcoal the city of which he had given a description. His ingenuity seduced the governor. He asked him to serve as a guide to some Spaniards he wished to send on this discovery, to which the Indian consented. 60 Spaniards offered themselves for the undertaking, and among others Don Antonio Santos. They set off and traveled nearly 500 leagues to the south through the most frightful roads. Hunger, the swamps, the woods, the precipices, the heat, the rains, destroyed almost all. When those who survived thought themselves 4 or 5 days' journey from the capital city, and hoped to reach the end of all their troubles, and the object of their desires, the Indian disappeared in the night. This event dismayed the Spaniards. They knew not where they were. By degrees they all perished but Santos, to whom it occurred to disguise himself as an Indian. He threw off his clothes, covered his whole body with red paint, and introduced himself among them by his knowledge of many of their languages. He was a long time among them, until at length he fell within the power of the Portuguese established on the banks of the Rio Negro. They embarked him on the river Amazon, and after a very long detention, sent him back to his country. In this very brief survey of the growth and results of the El Dorado legend, there is no room even to mention many of the most dramatic and disastrous expeditions which it inspired through the 16th century. It was, in truth, the greatest lost treasure story that the world has ever known. The age of those splendid adventurers has vanished. Exploration has proved that the golden city hidden in Guyana was a myth. And now and again investigation has harked back to the source of the tradition of the Gilded Man at the mountain lake of Guatavita on the lofty tableland of Bogota. Hernan de Quesada, first to try to drain the lake, was followed a few years later by Antonio de Sepulveda, who recovered treasure from the bottom to the amount of more than $100,000, besides a magnificent emerald which was sold at Madrid. Professor Liborio Zerda of the University of Columbia at Bogota has published his results of an exhaustive study of the legend and the evidence to show that the ceremonies of the Gilded Man were once performed at Guatavita. He describes a group of figures beaten out of raw gold, which was recovered from the lake and is now in the museum of that city. It represents the chief and attendants upon a balsa, or raft, and is considered to be a striking confirmation of the tradition.
Undoubtedly, this piece represents the religious ceremony which Zamora has described,
writes Professor Zerda, with the Caique of Guatavita surrounded by Indian priests on the raft
which was taken on the day of the ceremony
to the middle of the lake. It may be, as some persons believe, the Sequa Lagoon, and not the present Guatavita, was the place of the Dorado ceremony, and consequently the ancient Guatavita. But everything seems to indicate that there really was once a Dorado at Bogota. Zamora, who wrote in the 17th century, recorded that the Indians believed the spirit of the lake had built a magnificent palace beneath the water, where she dwelt and demanded offerings of gold and jewels, which belief spread over all the nation of the Muisca, and also among strangers, who all, stricken by this wonderful occurrence, came to offer their gifts by many different routes, of which even today some signs remain. In the center of the lake they threw their offerings with ridiculous and vain ceremonies. In 1823, Captain Charles Stewart Cochrane of the English Navy was traveling in Colombia, and he became keenly interested in the lake of Guatavita and the chances of recovering the lost treasure by means of a drainage project. He delved into the old Spanish records, assembled the traditions that were still alive among the Indians, and was convinced that a fabulous accumulation of gold awaited the enterprise of modern engineers. One of the ancient accounts, so he discovered, related that to escape the cruel persecution of the Spanish conquerors, the wealthy natives threw their gold into the lake, and that the last caique cast therein the burdens of 50 men laden with gold dust and nuggets. Captain Cochrane did not succeed in finding the funds needed to undertake the tempting task, but his information was preserved and made some stir in England and France. It was reserved for 20th century treasure seekers to attack the sacred lake of Guatavita and to capitalize the venture as a joint stock company with headquarters in London and a glittering prospectus offering investors an opportunity of obtaining shares in a prospective hoard of gold and jewels worth something like $1 billion. A concession was obtained from the government of Columbia, and work begun in 1903. As an engineering problem, draining the lake seemed practicable and comparatively inexpensive. It is a deep, transparent pool, hardly more than 1,000 feet wide, almost circular, and set like a jewel in a cup-like depression near the top of a cone-shaped peak, several hundred feet above the nearby plateau. The tunnel, therefore, had only to pierce the hillside to enter the lake and let the water flow out to the plain below. It was estimated that the shaft had to be driven a distance of 1,100 feet. A small village of huts was built to shelter the engineers and laborers, and rock drilling machinery set up not far from the still visible remains of one of the shafts dug by the Spanish treasure seekers of the 15th century. No serious obstacles were encountered until the tunnel had topped the bottom of the lake and the water began to run off through carefully regulated sluices. Then, as the surface lowered and the submerged mud was exposed to the air, it solidified in a cement-like substance, which was almost impossible to penetrate. The treasure must have sunk many feet deep in this mud during 4 or 5 centuries, and the workmen found it so baffling that operations were suspended. The promoters of the enterprise found this unexpected obstacle so much more than they had bargained for, that they had to abandon it for lack of resources. In their turn, they had been thwarted by the spirit of the Gilded Man, and the treasure of El Dorado is still beyond the grasp of its eager pursuers. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of the Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 14, The Wizardry of the Divining Rod. Washington Irving was so thoroughly versed in the lore of buried treasure that the necromancy of the divining rod, as a potent aid to this kind of industry, had received his studious attention. For many centuries, the magic wand of hazel, or various other woods, has been used and implicitly believed in as a guide to the whereabouts of secrets hidden underground, whether of running water, veins of metal, or buried treasure. There is nothing far-fetched, or contrary to the fact, in the lively picture of Dr. Nipperhausen, that experienced magician, who helped Wolfert Weber seek the treasure concealed by pirates on the Manhattan Island of the Knickerbocker Dutch of the Tales of a Traveler.
He had passed some years of his youth among the Harz Mountains of Germany, and had derived much valuable instruction from the miners touching the mode of seeking treasure buried in the earth. He had prosecuted his studies also under a traveling sage, who united the mysteries of medicine with magic and legerdemain. His mind, therefore, had become stored with all kinds of mystic lore. He had dabbled a little in astrology, alchemy, divination, knew how to detect stolen money, and to tell where springs of water lay hidden. In a word, by the dark nature of his knowledge he had acquired the name of the High German Doctor, which is pretty nearly equivalent to that of necromancer. The doctor had often heard rumors of treasure being buried in various parts of the island, and had long been anxious to get on the traces of it. No sooner were Wolfert's waking and sleeping vagaries confided to him than he beheld in them confirmed symptoms of a case of money-digging, and lost no time in probing it to the bottom. Wolfert had long been sorely oppressed in mind by the golden secret, and as a family physician is a kind of father-confessor, he was glad of any opportunity of unburdening himself. So far from curing, the doctor caught the malady from his patient. The circumstances unfolded to him awakened all his cupidity. He had not a doubt of money being buried somewhere in the neighborhood of the mysterious crosses, and offered to join Wolfert in the search. He informed him that much secrecy and caution must be observed in enterprises of this kind, that money is only to be digged for at night, with certain forms and ceremonies, in burning of drugs, the repeating of mystic words, and above all, that the seekers must first be provided with a divining rod, which had the wonderful property of pointing to the very spot on the surface of the earth under which treasure lay hidden. As the doctor had given much of his mind to these matters, he charged himself with all the necessary preparations, and as the quarter of the moon was propitious, he undertook to have the divining rod ready by a certain night. Wolfert's heart leaped with joy at having met with so learned and able a coadjutor. Everything went on secretly, but swimmingly. The doctor had many consultations with his patient, and the good woman of the household lauded the comforting effect of his visits. In the meantime, the wonderful divining rod that great key to nature's secrets, was duly prepared. The following note was found appended to this passage in the handwriting of Mr. Knickerbocker.
There has been much written against the divining rod by those light minds who are ever ready to scoff at the mysteries of nature, but I fully join with Dr. Nipperhausen in giving it my faith. I shall not insist upon its efficacy in discovering the concealment of stolen goods, the boundary stones of fields, the traces of robbers and murderers, or even the existence of subterranean springs and streams of water. Albeit, I think these properties not to be readily discredited, but of its potency in discovering veins of precious metal and hidden sums of money and jewels, I have not the least doubt. Some said that the rod turned only in the hands of persons who had been born in particular months of the year. Hence, astrologers had recourse to planetary influences when they would procure talisman. Others declared that the properties of the rod were either an effect of chance, or the fraud of the holder, or the work of the devil. The worthy and learned Mr. Knickerbocker might have gone on to quote authorities by the dozen. This weighty argument of his is not delivered with a wink to the reader. He is engaged in no solemn foolery. If one desires to find pirates' gold, it is really essential to believe in the divining rod and devoutly obey its magic messages. This is proven to the hilt by that very scholarly Abbé Laurent de Vallemont of France, whose exhaustive volume was published in 1693 with the title of La Physique Occulte, or Treatise on the Divining Rod and its Uses for the Discovery of Springs of Water, Metallic Veins, Hidden Treasure, Thieves, and Escaped Murderers. In his preface, he politely sneers at those scholars who consider the study of the divining rod as an idle pursuit, and shows proper vexation toward the ignorance and prejudice which are hostile to such researches. The author then indicates that the action of the divining rod is to be explained by the theory of corpuscular philosophy, and by way of concrete argument refers to the most famous case in the ancient annals of this art.
It seems to me that my work would have been incomplete had I not seen Jacques Aymar, and that the objection might have been raised that I had only argued about statements not generally accepted. This now famous man came to Paris on January 21st, 1693. I saw him 2 or 3 hours a day for nearly a month. My readers may rest assured that during that time I examined him very closely. It is a positive fact that the divining rod turned in his hands in the direction of springs of water, precious metals, thieves, and escaped murderers. He does not know why. If he knew the physical cause, and had sufficient intellect to reason about it, I am convinced that whenever he undertook an experiment he would succeed. But a peasant who can neither read nor write will know still less about atmosphere, volume, motion of corpuscles distributed in the air, etc. He is still more ignorant as to how these corpuscles can be disturbed and cease to produce the motion and dip of the rod. Neither is he capable of recognizing how essential to success it is for him to know whether he is in a fit condition to be susceptible to the action of the corpuscles which are thrown off from the object toward which the rod inclines. I do not deny that there are cheats who profess belief in the rod and put it to too many uses, just as quacks, with a good remedy for a special ailment, hold themselves up to contempt by wishing to palm it off as a cure-all. To this I add that people will be found who, endowed with greater and more delicate sensibility, will possess still more abundantly than he, Jacques Aymar, the faculty of discovering springs of water, metallic veins, and hidden treasure, as well as thieves and escaped murderers. We have already received tidings from Lyon of a youth of 18 who surpasses by a long way Jacques Aymar, and anyone can see in Paris today, at the residence of Monsieur Geoffrey, late sheriff of that city, a young man who discovers gold buried underground by experiencing violent tremors the moment that he walks over it.
Monsieur de Vallemont has no sympathy for those credulous students of natural philosophy who have brought the science into disrepute. They will scoff at the divining rod and yet swallow the grossest frauds without so much as blinking. He proceeds to give an illustration, and it will bear translating, because surely it unfolds a unique yarn of buried treasure, and has all the charm of novelty.
Upon this subject there is nothing more entertaining than that which took place at the end of the last century, with regard to a boy who journeyed through several towns exhibiting a golden tooth which he declared had grown in the usual way. In the year 1595, towards Easter, a rumor spread that there was in the village of Waldhorst in Silesia, Bohemia, a child 7 years of age who had lost all his teeth, and that in place of the last molar a gold tooth had appeared. No story ever created such a stir. Scholars took it up. In a short time doctors and philosophers came forward to gain knowledge and to pass judgment, as though it were a case worthy of their consideration. The first to distinguish himself was Jacobus Horstius, professor of medicine in the University of Helmstad. This doctor, in a paper which he caused to be printed, demonstrated that this golden tooth was partly a work of nature and partly miraculous, and he declared that in whatever light one viewed it, it was manifestly a consolation sent from above to the Christians of Bohemia, on whom the Turks were then inflicting the worst barbarities. Martinus Rulandus published simultaneously with Horstius the story of the golden tooth. It is true that 2 years later, Johannes Engelstesserus refuted the story of Rulandus, but the latter in the same year, 1597, not in the least discouraged, defended his work against the attacks of Engelstesserus. Andreas Libavius then entered the lists and published a book in which he recounted what had been said for and against the golden tooth. This gave rise to great disputes concerning a matter which ultimately proved to be a somewhat clumsy deception. A child was taken to Breslau, where everybody hastened to see so wonderful a novelty. They brought him before a number of doctors assembled in great perplexity to examine the famous golden tooth. Amongst them was Christophorus Rumbaumius, a professor of medicine, who was most anxious to see before believing. First of all, a goldsmith, wishing to satisfy himself that the tooth was of gold, applied it to his touchstone, and the line left on the stone appeared, to the naked eye, to be in real gold. But on the application of aqua fortis to this line, every trace disappeared, and a part of the swindle was exposed. Christophorus Rumbaumius, an intelligent and skilful man, on examining the tooth more closely, perceived in it a little hole, and, inserting a probe, found that it was simply a sheet of copper, probably washed with gold. He could with ease have removed the copper covering had not the trickster, who was taking the child from town to town, opposed it, complaining bitterly of the injury that was being done to him by thus depriving him of the chance of taking money from the curious and the credulous. The swindler and child disappeared, and no one knows to this day exactly what became of them. But because learned men have been duped now and then, that is no reason for perpetual doubt, and although the story of the golden tooth be false, we should be wrong capriciously to reject that of the hazel rod, which has become so famous. Having extinguished the skeptics, as one snuffs a candle, by means of this admirable tale of the golden tooth, the learned author asserts that it must denote great ignorance of France, and even of books, never to have heard of the divining rod, for I can say with certainty that I have met, quite by chance, both in Paris and in the provinces, more than 50 persons who have used this simple instrument in order to find water, precious metals, and hidden treasure, and in whose hands it is actually turned. It is more reasonable, says Father Malebranche, to believe one man who says, "I have seen," than a million others who talk at random. It is somewhat difficult to determine exactly the period at which the divining rod first came into use. I have discovered no reference to it by writers previous to the middle of the 15th century. It is frequently referred to in the Testament de Basil Valentin, a Benedictine monk who flourished about 1490, and I observe that he speaks of it in a way which might lead one to suppose that the use of this rod was known before that period. Might we venture to advance the theory that the divine rod was known and used nearly 2,000 years ago? Are we to count for naught Cicero's allusion to divination by means of the rod at the end of the first book of his Theophysis?
If all we need for our nourishment and clothing comes to us, as people say, by means of some divine rod, then each of us should relinquish public affairs and devote all his time to the study.
Varro, according to Petronius Maurus, left a satire called Virgila Divina, which was often quoted by Nanius Marcellus in his book entitled De Propriete Sermonum. But what serves to convince me that Cicero had in his mind the hazel twig, and that it was known at that period, is the passage he quotes from Ennius in the first half of his De Divination, in which the poet, scoffing at those who for a drachma profess to teach the art of discovering hidden treasure, says to them,
"I will give it to you with pleasure, but it will be paid out of the treasure found according to your method."
And so this 17th century Frenchman, his manner as wise as a tree full of owls, drones along from one musty authority to another in defense of the mystic powers of the divining rod. He marshals them in batteries of heavy artillery, names of scholars and alleged scientists who made a great noise in their far-off times when the world was younger and more given to wonderment. The discussions that raged among those dry as dusts have interest today because the doctrine of the divining rod is still vigorously alive, and its rites are practiced in every civilized country. Call it what you will, a curiously surviving superstition or a natural mystery. The dowser, with its forked twig of hazel or willow, still commands a large following of believers, and his services are sought, in hundreds of instances every year, to discover springs of water and hidden treasure. Learned societies have not done with debating the case, and the literature of the phenomenon is in process of making. No one, however, has contributed more formidable ammunition than M. de Valmont, who could discharge such broadsides as this.
Father Roberti, who writes in the strongest terms against the divining rod, nevertheless admits, in the heat of the conflict, that the indications on which the most scholarly of men set to work to discover mineral soil are all more or less unreliable, and result in endless mistakes. What, says this Jesuit father, is it possible that people are willing to attribute greater knowledge and judgment to a rough and lifeless piece of wood than to hundreds of enlightened men? They survey fields, mountains, and valleys, devoting scrupulous attention to everything that comes under their notice. Not a trace of metal do they discover, and if they happen to suspect that there might be such a thing at a certain spot, they confess that their surmise may be quite unfounded, and that every day they learn to their sorrow, after infinite labor and suspense, that their signs are altogether deceptive. Such a one as Goclenius, however, armed with his fork, will wander over the same ground, and led by that instrument, clearer sighted than the wisest of men, will infallibly come to a standstill over treasures hidden in the earth. Excavations will be made at the spot indicated, and the treasure will be laid bare. My dear reader, do you wish me to speak candidly? Is it the devil who is guiding Goclenius?
In this emphatic statement of the devout French priest of 2 centuries ago is to be traced the still lingering superstition of an infernal partnership in buried treasure. It is to be found in scores of coast-wise legends of pirates' gold. No kid story is properly decorated without its guardian demon or menacing ghost. And the divining rod, handed down from an age of witchcraft, necromancy, and black magic, deserves a place in the kit of every well-equipped treasure-seeker. Sober, hard-headed Scotchmen from Glasgow employ a Yorkshire dowser to search for the treasure lost in the Florencia galleon in Tobermory Bay. And he shows them, and they are convinced, that he can tell whether it be gold or silver or copper which exerts its occult influence over his divining rod. This happens in the year 1906, mind you, but our ardent investigator, Sieur de Valmont, was writing 200 years before.
But with the divining rod, it is possible to distinguish what metal is contained in the mine towards which the rod inclines. For if a gold coin be placed in each hand, the rod will only turn in the direction of gold, because it becomes impregnated with the corpuscles, or minute particles of gold. If silver be treated in the same way, the rod will only dip towards silver. This, at any rate, is what we are told by those who pride themselves on their successful use of the rod.
John Steers, the expert diviner, who was recently employed at Tobermory Bay, is more frequently retained to search for water than for lost treasure. This is his vocation, and he takes it seriously enough, as his own words indicate.
The power is not in the rod, but in the user, the rod acting as an indicator, and rising when over a stream. By moving the arms as I proceed, I can keep on the edge of an underground stream, for the apex descends when the rod is not over the stream. I have several times followed a line of water down to the shore, being rowed out in the bay, and found the water boiling up mixed with landweeds. At such a spot there is no movement of the rod except over the course of the stream. It is almost impossible to describe the sensation caused whilst using the rod. It is sometimes like a current of electricity going through the arms and legs. On raising 1 foot from the ground, the rod descends. The effect produced when walking is that the rod has the appearance of a fishing rod when the fish is hooked. The rod seems alive. Move it clear of the line of water and it goes down. Very few people have the gift of finding water or minerals, and not many rods will do. But those that have thorns on them are all right. In the tropics I use acacia, and in southern Europe the holly or orange. The use of the rod is exhausting. If I have been at it a few hours, the power gradually gets less. A rest and some sandwiches produce fresh power, and I can start again. I think the friction of the water against the rock underground must cause some electric current, for if the person using the rod stands on a piece of glass, India rubber, or other insulating material, all power leaves him.
In Kashmir, the rod is used before a well is sunk, and when the French army went to Tonkin, they used the rod for finding drinking water at their camps, as they feared the wells were poisoned. If the divining rod is able to fathom the secrets of underground water channels, it must be as potent in the case of buried treasure. Several years ago, the claims of the modern dowsers were investigated by no less an authority than Professor W.F. Barrett, holding the chair of experimental physics in the Royal College of Science for Ireland. The results were presented to the Society of Psychical Research and published in 2 volumes of its proceedings. He said in its introductory pages,
At first sight, few subjects appear to be so unworthy of serious notice and so utterly beneath scientific investigation as that of the divining rod. To most men of science, the reported achievements of the diviner are on par with the rogueries of Sir Walter Scott's Dousterswivel. That anyone with the smallest scientific training should think it worth his while to devote a considerable amount of time and labor to an inquiry into the alleged evidence on behalf of the rod will appear to my scientific friends about as sensible as if he spent his time investigating fortune-telling or any other relic of superstitious folly. Nor was my own prejudice against the subject any less than that of others, for I confess that it was with great reluctance and even repugnance that some 6 years ago, yielding to the earnest request of the Council of the Society for Psychical Research, I began an investigation of the matter, hoping, however, in my ignorance, that a few weeks' work would enable me to relegate it to a limbo large and broad, since called the Paradise of Fools.
In the summing up of his exhaustive investigations, Professor Barrett committed himself to these conclusions.
1. That the twisting of the forked twig, or so-called divining rod, is due to involuntary muscular action on the part of the dowser. 2. That this is the result of an ideomotor action, any idea or suggestion, whether conscious or subconscious, that is associated in the dowser's mind with the twisting of the twig, will cause it to turn apparently spontaneously in his hands. 3. Hence the divining rod has been used in the search for all sorts of things, from criminals to water, its actions being precisely similar to the endule explorateur, i.e. a small suspended ball or ring, depended by a thread from the hand. 4. Dismissing, therefore, the mere twisting of the forked rod, the question at issue is, how is the suggestion derived by the dowser that starts this involuntary muscular action? Here the answer is a very complex and difficult one. 5. Careful and critical examination shows that certain dowsers, not all in whose hands the twig turns, have a genuine facility or faculty for finding underground water beyond that possessed by ordinary well sinkers. Part of this success is due, first, to shrewd observation and the conscious and unconscious detection of the surface signs of underground water. Second, a residue, say 10% or 15% of their successes, cannot be so explained, nor can these be accounted for by chance nor lucky hits, the proportion being larger than the doctrine of probabilities would account for. This residue no known scientific explanation can account for. Personally, I believe the explanation will be found in some faculty akin to clairvoyance, but as the science of today does not recognize such a faculty, I prefer to leave the explanation to future inquirers, and to throw on the skeptic the task of disproving my assertions and giving his own explanations.
This unexplained residue, akin to clairvoyance, as admitted by a scientist of today, who wears a top hat and rides in taxicabs, clothes the divining rod in the same alluring mystery which so puzzled those childlike and credulous observers of remote and misty centuries. The Abbé de Valmont, writing in 1697, found the problem hardly more difficult to explain than does this professor of experimental physics in the Royal College of Science. The wise men of the 17th century strove hard to comprehend the unexplained residue, each after his own fashion. Michael Maris, in his book entitled Verum Inventum Hoc Est Munera Germanae, claimed that the world was indebted to Germany for the invention of gunpowder, and stated that the first wood charcoal used in its manufacture, mixed with sulfur and saltpeter, was made from the hazel tree. This led him to refer to the sympathy existing between hazelwood and metals, and to add that for this reason the divining rod was made of this particular wood, which was peculiarly adapted to the discovery of hidden gold and silver. Philip Melanchthon, 1497 to 1560, famously learned in natural philosophy and theology, discoursed on sympathy, of which he recognized 6 degrees in nature, and in the second of these he named that sympathy or affinity which is found to exist between plants and minerals. He used as an illustration the forked hazel twig employed by those who search after gold, silver, and other precious metals. He attributed the movement of the rod to the metallic juices which nourish the hazel tree in the soil, and he was therefore convinced that its particular manifestations were wholly sympathetic and according to natural law. Nucius spoke of the divining rod as a marvel from the bounteous hands of nature, and exhorted men to use it in the search for mineral wealth and concealed treasure. Enchanted with this insignificant-looking instrument, he exclaimed,
"What shall I say now concerning the divine rod, which is but a simple hazel twig, and yet possesses the power of divination in the discovery of metals, be that power derived from mutual sympathy, from some secret astral influence, or from some still more powerful source? Let's take courage and use this salutary rod, so that, after having withdrawn the metals from the abode of the dead, we may seek in the metals themselves some such faculty for divination as we find in the hazel."
Rudolf Glauber, who made many experiments with the rod, had this to say of it.
"Metallic veins can also be discovered by means of the hazel rod. It is used for that purpose, and I speak after long experience. Melt the metals under a certain constellation, and make a ball of them pierce through the middle. Thrust into the hole thus formed a young sprig of hazel of the same year, with no branches. Carry this rod straight in front of you, over the places where metals are believed to be, and when a rod dips and the ball inclines towards the soil, you may rest assured that metal lies beneath. And as this method is based on natural law, it should undoubtedly be used in preference to any other."
Egidius Gustman, supposedly a Rosicrucian friar, and author of a work entitled La Révélation de la Divine Majesté, devoted a chapter to the study of the question whether hazel rods may be used without sin in the search for metals. He reached the conclusion that there could be nothing unchristian in their employment for the discovery of gold and silver, provided neither words, ceremonies, nor enchantments be called into requisition, and that it be done in the fear and under the eyes of God. Monsieur de Vallemont quotes as his final authority the Abbé Gallet, Grand Penitentiary of the Church of the Carpentras. He considers that the Abbé's high position in the Church, and his deep knowledge of physics and mathematics, should lend great weight to his opinion concerning the divining rod. He therefore requests a mutual friend to put to the Abbé this question:
Is not the inclination of the rod due to sleight of hand or something in which the devil may play a part?
The Abbé returns a long reply in Latin, which de Vallemont is pleased to translate and print in his book. It opens thus:
Monsieur l'Abbé Gallet declares in his own hand that the rod turns in the direction of water and of metals, that he has used it several times with admirable success in order to find watercourses and hidden treasure, and that he is far from agreeing with those who maintain that there is in it any trickery or diabolical influence.
William Cookworthy, who flourished in England about 1750, was a famous exponent of the divining rod, and he laid down a most elaborate schedule of directions for its use in finding hidden treasure or veins of gold or silver. In conclusion, he sagely observed, "I would remark that 'tis plain a person may be very easily deceived in making experiments with this instrument, there being, in metallic countries, vast quantities of attracting stones scattered through the earth, the attractions of springs continually occurring, and even about towns, bits of iron, pins, etc., may easily be the means of deceiving the unwary, whereas quantity makes no alteration in the strength, but only in the wideness of the attraction. A pin under 1 foot would stop the attraction of any quantity of every other sort, but gold, which might be under the other. Whoever, therefore, will make experiments need be very cautious in exploring the ground, and be sure not to be too anxious, for which reason I would advise him, in case of debates, not to be too warm and lay wagers on the success, but unruffled leave the unbelievers to their infidelity, and permit time and providence to convince people of the reality of the thing." If one would know how to fashion the divining rod to give most surely the magic results, he has only to consult the Shepherd's Calendar and Countryman's Companion, in which it is affirmed, Cut a hazel wand forked at the upper end like a Y. Peel off the rind and dry it in a moderate heat, then steep it in the juice of wake robin or nightshade, and cut the single lower end sharp. And where you suppose any rich mine or treasure is near, place a piece of the same metal you conceive is hid in the earth to the tip of one of the forks, by a hair or very fine silk or thread, and do the like to the other end. Pitch the sharp single end lightly to the ground at the going down of the sun, the moon being at the increase, and in the morning at sunrise, by a natural sympathy, you will find the metal inclining, as it were, pointing to the place where the other is hid. According to the author of the modern book, The Divining Rod and Its Uses,
it is curious to note that about 100 years ago there was considerable excitement in the north of England, owing to the remarkable powers possessed by a lady of quality in the district, this being no other than Judith Noel, afterwards Lady Millbank, the mother of Lady Byron. Miss Noel discovered her marvelous faculty when a mere girl, yet so afraid was she of being ridiculed that she would not publicly declare it, thinking she might be called a witch, or that she would not get a husband. Lady Millbank afterwards overcame her prejudice and used the rod on many occasions with considerable success.
About 1880, a certain Madame Calava of Paris was at the height of her fame as a high priestess of the divining rod, and her pretensions with respect to finding buried treasure quite set France by the ears. She was besought to discover, among other hoards, the 12 golden effigies taken from the Sainte-Chapelle during the Revolution and hidden underground for safekeeping, the treasure of King Stanislaus, buried outside the gates of Nancy, and the vast accumulations of the Petits Pares, or begging friars. The French government took Madame seriously and permitted her to operate by means of an agreement which should ensure a proper division of the spoils. There could be no better authority for the singular exploits of Madame Calava than the columns of the London Times, which stated in the issue of October 6, 1882, "A certain Madame Calava, who in spite of a long experience does not yet bring the credentials of success, is said to be exploring the pavement of St. Denis in search of buried treasures. The French government likes partnerships, conventions, and co-dominions, and it insists on what almost amounts to the lion's share of the spoil. Nevertheless, a good many people have been found to invest largely in the enterprise, which will cost something if it comes to actual digging. The investigation itself is not in the nature of an excavation, nor is it with the spade or the pickaxe, unless, indeed, it should turn out that it is a veritable gold mine under St. Denis, when the royal monuments may be thankful even if dynamite be not freely resorted to. The divining rod is to lead the way. At the beginning of this century, France was one vast field of buried treasure. The silver coin was so bulky that 200 pounds of our money would be a hundredweight to carry, and 1,000 pounds would be a cartload. So it was buried in the hope of a speedy return. The fugitive owners perished or died in exile. Their successors on the spot came upon one hoard after another and said nothing about it. That they did find the money and put it in circulation, there could be no doubt, for it was impossible to take a handful of silver 40 years ago without 1 or 2 pieces showing a green rust in place of a white luster. This was the result of long interment, and calculations were made as to the likely total of the exhumation. But one then heard nothing of the divining rod, not at least in cities, in cathedrals, among the sepulchres of kings, and in the Department of State. Our first wish is that the experiment may be quite successful. It would be so very surprising, quite a new sensation, much wanted in these days. But there would be something more than a passing sensation. Even a moderate success would discover to us a means of support and a mode of existence far easier and pleasanter than any yet known. We should only have to walk about very slowly with the orthodox rod, properly held and handled, keeping our attention duly fixed on the desirableness of a little more money, and we should find it springing up, as it were, from the ground before us. The French Minister of Fine Arts need not be deterred, nay, it is plain he is not deterred, by the scruples that interrupted the investigations of the great Linné, and stopped him on the very threshold of verification. On one of his travels, his secretary brought him a divining wand with an account of its powers. Linné hid a purse containing 100 ducats under a ranunculus in the garden. He then took a number of witnesses, who experimented with the wand all over the ground, but without success.
Indeed, they trod the ground so completely that Lene could not find where he had buried the purse. Then they brought in the man with the wand, and he immediately pointed out the right direction, and then the very spot where the money lay. Lene's remark was that another experiment would convert him to the wand, but he resolved not to be converted, and therefore did not repeat the experiment. Possibly feeling that it was neither science nor religion, he would have nothing to do with any other conceivable alternative. In the London Times of November 3rd, 1882, there was published under the head of Foreign Intelligence the following dispatch, which may be regarded as a tragic sequel of the foregoing paragraphs. The titular Archbishop of Lepanto, who is the head of the chapter of St. Denis, has addressed a remonstrance to the government against the renewed divining rod experiments on which Madame Calava is insisting under her compact with the state for a division of the spoils. He dwells on the absurdity of the theory that on the revolutionary seizure of 1793 the Benedictines could have concealed a portion of their treasures, of which printed lists existed, and the most valuable of which were notoriously confiscated. As to the notion of an earlier secretion of treasures, the memory of which has perished, he urges that St. Denis, having belonged to the Benedictines from its very erection, no motive for secretion existed, and had there been any, the tradition or record of it would have been preserved, while at least 4 successive reconstructions would certainly have brought any such treasure to light. The mob of 1793, moreover, actually ransacked the vaults after the removal of the bodies for the very purpose of discovering such secret hoards. St. Denis, in short, is the very last place in the world for treasure trove, and as for the central crypt, which the sorceress claims to break into, it was rifled in 1793 when it contained 53 bodies, which left no vacant space. The Archbishop need scarcely have troubled himself with this demonstration. Public ridicule has made an end of the project, and even if Madame Calava carried out her threat of a lawsuit, no tribunal would hold her entitled to carry on excavations ad libitum, with a risk, perhaps, of herself and her workmen being buried under the ruins of the finest of French cathedrals. In debating the Fine Arts Department estimates, M. Delattre, deputy for St. Denis, animadverted on the divining rod experiments in the cathedral. M. Terrard replied that the government had no share in this ridiculous business. The treaty with the sorceress was concluded in January 1881 by an official who had since been superannuated, but was not acted upon till she could deposit 200 francs guarantee, and as soon as he himself heard of the experiments, he put a peremptory stop to them. It is important here to observe that it afterwards transpired that the object of Madame Calava's lawsuit was not so much to obtain damages for any breach of contract as to vindicate her private and public character and her professional reputation as a so-called diviner from the odium, scorn, and defamation which the repudiation of the treaty so universally entailed. The sad result of all this was that the unfortunate and sensitive lady was not able to withstand the opprobrium that was heaped upon her, nor the ridicule that made an end of her project. This maligned and misunderstood lady, who, as expressly stated, had no doubt brought a good pedigree with her, after a few months of sorrow, and conscious of her rectitude, at length succumbed, and as reported, ultimately died of a broken heart. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of the Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 15. Sundry Pirates and Their Booty. 7 years were gone and over. Wild Roger came again. He spoke of forays and of frays upon the Spanish Main, and he had stores of gold galore, and silks and satins fine, and flasks and casks of Malavoisie and precious Gascon wine. Rich booties he had brought, he said, across the western wave. Roger was the same man still. He scorned his brother's prayers. He called his crew, away he flew, and on those foreign shores got killed in some outlandish place. They called it the Azores. Ingoldsby Legends. The popular delusion that pirates found nothing better to do with their plunder than to bury it like so many thrifty depositors in savings banks clashes with what is known of the habits and temperaments of many of the most industrious rovers under the black flag. By way of a concluding survey of the matter, let us briefly examine the careers of diverse pirates of sorts, and try to ascertain what they did with their gold, and whether it be plausible to assume that they had any of it left to bury. Of course, romance and legend are up in arms at the presumption that any well-regulated and orthodox pirate omitted the business with the pick and shovel and the chart with the significant crosses and compass bearings, but the prosaic facts of history are due to have their innings. For example, there was Jean Lafitte, who amassed great riches in the pursuit of his profession, and whose memory has inspired innumerable treasure-seeking expeditions in the Gulf of Mexico and along the coast of Central America. After ravaging the commerce of the East India Company in the waters of the Far East, he set up his headquarters on an island among the bayous and cypress swamps of that desolate region below New Orleans that is known as Barataria. A deep-water pass ran to the open sea, only 2 leagues distant, and on the shores of the sheltered harbor of Grand Terre, Lafitte organized the activities of a large number of pirates and smugglers, and formed a flourishing colony, a corporation in this way, for disposing of the merchandise filched from honest shipping. These marauders posed as privateers, and some of them had French and other commissions for sailing against the Spanish. But there was a great deal of laxity in such trifles as living up to the letter of the law. At Grand Terre, Lafitte and his people sold the cargoes of their prizes by public auction, and from all parts of lower Louisiana bargain hunters flocked to Barataria to deal in this tempting traffic. The goods thus purchased were smuggled into New Orleans and other nearby ports, and Lafitte's piratical enterprises became so notorious that the government of the United States sent an expedition against him in 1814, commanded by Commodore Patterson. At Grand Terre he found a settlement so great in force and numbers as to constitute a small kingdom ruled by Lafitte. The Commodore described the encounter in a letter to the Secretary of War, and said in part, "At 8:30 a.m. on the 16th of June, made the island of Barataria, and discovered a number of vessels in the harbor, some of which showed the colors of Cartagena. At 2 o'clock, perceived the pirates forming their vessels, 10 in number, including prizes, into a line of battle near the entrance of the harbor, and making every preparation to offer battle. At 10 o'clock, wind light and variable, formed the order of battle with 6 gunboats, and the Seahorse tender, mounting 1 6-pounder and 15 men, and a launch mounting 1 12-pound carronade, the schooner Carolina drawing too much water to cross the bar. At 10:30 o'clock, perceived several smokes along the coast as signals, and at the same time a white flag hoisted on board a schooner at the fort, an American flag at the mainmast head, and a Cartagenian flag, under which the pirates cruise, at her topping lift. I replied with a white flag at my main. At 11 o'clock discovered that the pirates had fired 2 of the best schooners, hauled down my white flag, and made the signal for battle, hoisting a large flag bearing the words, 'Pardon for deserters,' having heard there was a number on shore from our army and navy. At 11:15 o'clock, 2 gunboats grounded, and were passed, agreeably to my previous orders, by the other 4 which entered the harbor, manned by my barge and the boats belonging to the grounded vessels, and proceeded in. To my great disappointment, I perceived that the pirates had abandoned their vessels, and were flying in all directions. I immediately sent the launch and 2 barges with small boats in pursuit of them. At meridian, took possession of all their vessels in the harbor, consisting of 6 schooners and 1 felucca, cruisers and prizes of the pirates, 1 brig, a prize, and 2 armed schooners under the Cartagenian flag, both in a line of battle with the armed vessels of the pirates, and apparently with an intention to aid them in any resistance they might make against me. As their crews were at quarters, tompions out of their guns, and matches lighted, Colonel Ross, with 75 infantry, at the same time landed and took possession of their establishment on shore, consisting of about 40 houses of different sizes, badly constructed and thatched with palmetto leaves. When I perceived the enemy forming their vessels into a line of battle, I felt confident from their number, and very advantageous position, and their number of men, that they would have fought me. Their not doing so I regret, for had they, I should have been able more effectually to destroy or make prisoners of them and their leaders. The enemy had mounted on their vessels 20 pieces of cannon of different caliber, and as I have since learned, had from 800 to 1,000 men of all nations and colors. Notwithstanding this unfriendly visit, Lafitte was a patriot after his own fashion, and during the War of 1812 his sympathies were with the American forces. In September 1814, Captain Lockyer, of a British naval vessel, anchored in the pass of Barataria, and delivered to Lafitte a packet of documents, comprising a proclamation addressed to the inhabitants of Louisiana by Colonel Edward Nichols, commander of the English forces on the coast of Florida, a letter from him to Lafitte, and another from the Honorable W.H. Percy, captain of the sloop of war Hermes. The upshot of all this was a proposal that Lafitte enter the British naval service in command of a frigate, and if he would take his men with him, he should have $30,000, payable at Pensacola. Lafitte refused the tempting bait, and 2 days later sent the following letter to Governor Claiborne of the state of Louisiana. Barataria, September 4th, 1814. Sir, in the firm persuasion that the choice made of you to fill the office of the first magistrate of this state was dictated by the esteem of your fellow citizens and was conferred on merit, I confidently address you on an affair on which may depend the safety of this country. I offer to restore to this state several citizens who perhaps in your eyes have lost that sacred title. I offer you them, however, such as you could wish to find them, ready to exert their utmost efforts in defense of the country. This point of Louisiana which I occupy is of great importance in the present crisis. I tender my services to defend it, and the only reward I ask is that a stop be put to the proscription against me and my adherents, by an act of oblivion, for all that has been done hitherto. I am the stray sheep wishing to return to the fold. If you are thoroughly acquainted with the nature of my offenses, I shall appear to you much less guilty, and still worthy to discharge the duties of a good citizen. I have never sailed under any flag but that of the Republic of Cartagena, and my vessels are perfectly regular in that respect. If I could have brought my lawful prizes into the ports of this state, I should not have employed the illicit means that have caused me to be proscribed. I decline saying more on the subject until I have the honor of your Excellency's answer, which I am persuaded can be dictated only by wisdom. Should your answer not be favorable to my desires, I declare to you that I will instantly leave the country to avoid the imputation of having cooperated towards an invasion of this point, which cannot fail to take place, and to rest secure in the acquittal of my conscience. I have the honor to be your Excellency's, etc., J. Lafitte. This highly commendable document so favorably impressed Governor Claiborne that he offered Lafitte safe conduct to come to New Orleans and meet General Andrew Jackson. After a conference of this trio, the following order was issued. The governor of Louisiana, being informed that many individuals implicated in the offenses heretofore committed against the United States at Barataria, express a willingness at the present crisis to enroll themselves and march against the enemy, he does hereby invite them to join the standard of the United States, and is authorized to say, should their conduct in the field meet the approbation of the Major General, that the officer will unite with the governor in a request to the President of the United States to extend to each and every individual so marching and acting a free and full pardon. At the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, Lafitte and his lieutenant, Dominique, commanded a large force of what Jackson called Corsairs of Barataria, and defended their breastworks and served their batteries with such desperate gallantry that they nobly earned the promised pardons. These were granted by President James Madison on February 6th, and he took occasion to say, "But it has since been represented that the offenders have manifested a sincere repentance, that they have abandoned the prosecution of the worst cause for the support of the best, and particularly that they have exhibited in the defense of New Orleans unequivocal traits of courage and fidelity. Offenders who have refused to become the associates of the enemy in the war upon the most seductive terms of invitation, and who have aided to repel his hostile invasion of the territory of the United States, can no longer be considered as objects of punishment, but as objects of a generous forgiveness." The foregoing evidence is ample to prove that Lafitte had no occasion to bury any of his treasure. Like Kidd, along the New England coast, legend has been busy with his name, and is blind to the facts of record. He later made a settlement on the island of Galveston, and his history becomes obscured. One version is that the love of the old trade was in his blood, and he fitted out a large privateer to have a farewell fling with fortune. A British sloop of war overhauled him in the Gulf of Mexico, hailed him as a pirate, and opened fire. The engagement was terrifically hot, and Jean Lafitte was killed at the head of his men while resisting a boarding party. take next the case of that noted pirate, Captain Avery, whose adventures were the subject of general conversation in Europe. He captured one of the great Mongol ships laden with treasure. It was reported he had wedded a daughter of that magnificent ruler and was about to found a new monarchy, that he gave commissions in his own name to the captains of his ships and the commanders of his forces, and was acknowledged by them as their prince. With 16 stout fellows of his own kidney, he ran off with a ship in which he had sailed from England as mate, and steered for Madagascar in the year 1715. The pirate's own book tells the story of Captain Avery, his treasure, and the melancholy fate of both, and the author is, as a rule, such a well-informed historian of these matters that he should be allowed to set it forth in his own words, which are framed in the style admirably befitting the theme.
Near the river Indus, the man at the masthead espied a sail upon which they gave chase. As they came nearer to her, they discovered that she was a tall vessel that might turn out to be an East Indiaman. She, however, proved a better prize, for when they fired at her, she hoisted Mongol colors and seemed to stand upon her defense. Avery only cannonaded at a distance, when some of the men began to suspect he was not the hero they had supposed. His sloops, however, attacked, the one on the bow, and another upon the quarter of the ship, and so boarded her. She then struck her colors. She was one of the great Mongol's own ships, and there were in her several of the greatest persons in his court, among whom, it was said, was one of his daughters going upon a pilgrimage to Mecca, and they were carrying with them rich offerings to present at the shrine of Mahomet. It is a well-known fact that the people of the East travel with great magnificence, so that these had along with them all their slaves and attendants, with a large quantity of vessels of gold and silver, and immense sums of money to defray their expenses by land. The spoil, therefore, which they received from that ship was almost incalculable. Our adventurers made the best of their way back to Madagascar, intending to make that place the deposit of all their treasure, to build a small fort, and to keep always a few men there for its protection. Avery, however, disconcerted this plan and rendered it altogether unnecessary. While steering their course, he sent a boat to each of the sloops, requesting that the chiefs would come on board his ship to hold a conference. He suggested to them the necessity of securing the property which they had acquired, and observed that the main difficulty was to get it safe on shore, adding that if either of the sloops should be attacked alone, they would not be able to make any great resistance. That for his part, his ship was so strong, so well manned, and such a swift sailing vessel, that he did not think it possible for any other ship to take or overcome her. Accordingly, he proposed that all their treasure should be sealed up in 3 chests, that each of the captains should have a key, and that they should not be opened until all were present, that the chest should be then put on board his ship, and afterwards lodged in some safe place on land. This proposal seemed so reasonable, and so much for the common good, that it was agreed to without hesitation, and all the treasure was deposited in 3 chests and carried to Avery's ship. The weather being favorable, they remained all 3 in company during that and the next day. Meanwhile, Avery, tampering with his men, suggested that they had now on board what was sufficient to make them all happy. And what, continued he, should hinder us from going to some country where we are not known, and living on shore all the rest of our days in plenty? They soon understood his hint, and all readily consented to deceive the men of the sloops, and fly with all the booty. This they effected during the darkness of the following night. The reader may easily conjecture what were the feelings and indignation of the other 2 crews in the morning, when they discovered that Avery had made off with all their property. Avery and his men hastened towards America, and being strangers in that country, agreed to divide the booty, to change their names, and each separately to take up his residence and live in affluence and honor. Avery had been careful to conceal the greater part of the jewels and other valuable articles, so that his own riches were immense. Arriving at Boston, he was almost resolved to settle there, but as the greater part of his wealth consisted of diamonds, he was apprehensive that he could not dispose of them at that place without being taken up as a pirate. Upon reflection, therefore, he resolved to sail for Ireland, and in a short time arrived in the northern part of that kingdom, and his men dispersed into several places. Some of them obtained the pardon of King William and settled in that country. The wealth of Avery, however, now proved of small service and occasioned him great uneasiness. He cannot offer his diamonds for sale in that country without being suspected. Considering, therefore, what was best to be done, he thought there might be some person in Bristol he could venture to trust. Upon this he resolved, and going to Devonshire, sent one of his friends to meet him at a town called Bideford. When he had unbosomed himself to him and other pretended friends, they agreed that the safest plan was to put his effects in the hands of some wealthy merchants. No inquiry would be made how they came by them. One of these friends told him he was acquainted with some who were very fit for the purpose, and if he would allow them a handsome commission, they would do the business faithfully. Avery liked the proposal, particularly as he could think of no other way of managing this matter, since he could not appear to act for himself. Accordingly, the merchants paid Avery a visit at Bideford, where after strong protestations of honor and integrity, he delivered them his effects, consisting of diamonds and some vessels of gold. After giving him a little money for his present subsistence, they departed. He changed his name and lived quietly at Bideford, so that no notice was taken of him. In a short time his money was all spent, and he heard nothing from his merchants, though he wrote to them repeatedly. At last they sent him a small supply, but it was not sufficient to pay his debts. In short, the remittances they sent him were so trifling that he could with difficulty exist. He therefore determined to go privately to Bristol and have an interview with the merchants himself, where instead of money he met with a mortifying repulse. For when he desired them to come to an account with him, they silenced him by threatening to disclose his character, the merchants thus proving themselves as good pirates on land as he was on sea. Whether he was frightened by these menaces, or had seen some other person who recognized him, is not known. However, he went immediately to Ireland, and from thence solicited his merchants very strongly for a supply, but to no purpose, so that he was reduced to beggary. In this extremity he was determined to return and cast himself upon the mercy of these honest Bristol merchants, let the consequences be what it would. He went on board a trading vessel, and worked his passage over to Plymouth, from whence he travelled on foot to Bideford. He had been there but a few days when he fell sick and died, not being worth so much as would buy a coffin.
That very atrocious pirate, Charles Gibbs, squandered most of his treasure, but it may be some consolation to know that $20,000 of it, in silver coin, was buried on the beach of Long Island, a few miles from Southampton, as attested by the records of the United States Court of the Southern District of New York. Captain Gibbs was a thoroughly bad egg from first to last, and quite modern it is interesting to note, for he was hanged as recently as 1831. He was born in Rhode Island, raised on a farm, and ran away to sea in the Navy. It is to his credit that he is said to have served on board the Chesapeake in her famous battle with the Shannon. But after his release from Dartmoor as a British prisoner of war, he fell from grace and opened a groggery in Ann Street called the Tin Pot, a place full of abandoned women and dissolute fellows. He drank up all the profits, so went to sea again and found a berth in a South American privateer. Leading a mutiny, he gained the ship and made a pirate of her, frequenting Havana and plundering merchant vessels along the Cuban coast. He slaughtered their crews in cold blood and earned an infamous reputation for cruelty. In his confession, written while he was under sentence of death in New York, he stated that sometime in the course of the year 1819, he left Havana and came to the United States, bringing with him about $30,000 in gold. He passed several weeks in the city of New York, and then went to Boston, whence he took passage for Liverpool in the ship Emerald. Before he sailed, however, he had squandered a large amount of his money by dissipation and gambling. He remained in Liverpool a few months, and then returned to Boston. His residence in Liverpool at that time is satisfactorily ascertained from another source beside his own confession. A female now in New York was well acquainted with him there, where, she says, he lived like a gentleman, apparently with abundant means of support. In speaking of his acquaintance with this female, he says, "I fell in with a woman who I thought was all virtue, but she deceived me, and I am sorry to say that a heart that never felt abashed at scenes of carnage and blood was made a child of for a time by her, and I gave way to dissipation to drown the torment. How often, when the fumes of liquor have subsided, have I thought of my good and affectionate parents, and of their godlike advice. My friends advised me to behave myself like a man, and promised me their assistance, but the demons still haunted me, and I spurned their advice." After the adventure with the deceitful female, Gibbs was not as successful as formerly in his profession of piracy, and appears to have lost his grip. For several years he knocked about the seven seas in one sort of shady escapade or another, but he flung away whatever gold he harvested, and was driven to commit the sordid crime which brought him to the gallows. In November of 1830 he shipped as a seaman in the brig Vineyard, Captain William Thornby, from New Orleans to Philadelphia, with a cargo of cotton and molasses, and $54,000 in specie. Learning of the money on board, Gibbs cooked up a conspiracy to kill the captain and the mate, and persuaded Thomas Wansley, the steward, to help him put them out of the way. According to the testimony, others of the crew were implicated, but the court convicted only these two. The sworn statement of Seaman Robert Dawes is as red-handed a treasure story as could be imagined. When about 5 days out, I was told that there was money on board. Charles Gibbs, E. Church, and the steward then determined to take possession of the brig. They asked James Talbot, another member of the crew, to join them. He said no, as he did not believe there was money in the vessel. They concluded to kill the captain and mate, and if Talbot and John Brownrigg would not join them, to kill them also. The next night they talked of doing it, and got their clubs ready. I dared not say a word, as they declared they would kill me if I did. As they did not agree about killing Talbot and Brownrigg, their two shipmates, it was put off. They next concluded to kill the captain and mate on the night of November 22nd, but did not get ready. But on the night of the 23rd, between 12 and 1 o'clock, when I was at the helm, the steward came up with a light and a knife in his hand. He dropped the light, and seizing the pump brake, struck the captain with it over the head or back of the neck. The captain was sent forward by the blow, and hallowed, "Oh!" in murder once. He was then seized by Gibbs and the cook, one by the head and the other by the heels, and thrown overboard. Atwell and Church stood at the companionway to strike down the mate when he should come up. As he came up and inquired what was the matter, they struck him over the head. He ran back into the cabin, and Charles Gibbs followed him down. But as it was dark, he could not find him. Gibbs then came on deck for the light, with which he returned below. I left the helm to see what was going on in the cabin. Gibbs found the mate and seized him, while Atwell and Church came down and struck him with a pump brake and club. The mate was then dragged upon deck. They called for me to help them, and I came up. The mate seized my hand and gave me a death grip. 3 of them hove him overboard, but which 3 I do not know. The mate was not dead when cast overboard, but called after us twice while in the water. I was so frightened that I hardly knew what to do. Then they asked me to call Talbot, who was in the forecastle saying his prayers. He came up and said it would be his turn next, but they gave him some grog and told him not to be afraid, as they would not hurt him. If he was true to them, he should fare as well as they did. One of those who had been engaged in the bloody deed got drunk, and another became crazy. After killing the captain and mate, they set about overhauling the vessel, and got up 1 keg of Mexican dollars. Then they divided the captain's clothes and money, about $40 in a gold watch. Talbot, Brownrigg, and I, who were all innocent men, were obliged to do as we were commanded. I was sent to the helm and ordered to steer for Long Island. On the day following, they divided several kegs of the specie, amounting to $5,000 each, and made bags and sewed the money up. After this division, they divided the rest of the money without counting it. On Sunday, when about 15 miles south-southeast of Southampton Light, they got the boats out and put half the money in each, and then they scuttled the vessel and set fire to it in the cabin and took to the boats. Gibbs, after the murder, took charge of the vessel as captain. From the papers on board, we learned that the money belonged to Stephen Gerard. With the boats, we made land about daylight. I was in a longboat with 3 others. The rest with Atwell were in a jolly boat. On coming to the bar, the boat stuck, and we threw overboard a great deal of money, in all about $5,000. The jolly boat foundered. We saw it fill and heard them cry out, saw them clinging to the masts. We went ashore on Barren Island and buried the money in the sand, but very lightly. Soon after, we met with a gunner, whom we requested to conduct us where we could get some refreshments. They were by him conducted to Johnson's, the only man living on the island, where we stayed all night. I went to bed about 10 o'clock. Jack Brownrigg sat up with Johnson, and in the morning told me he had told Johnson all about the murders. Johnson went in the morning with the steward for the clothes, which were left on top of the place where they buried the money, but I don't believe they took away the money. Here was genuine buried treasure, but the circumstances were such as to make the once terrible Captain Charles Gibbs cut a wretched figure. to the ignominious crime of killing the captain and mate of a little trading brig had descended this freebooter of renown, who had numbered his prizes by the score and boasted of slaying their crews wholesale. As for the specie looted from the brig Vineyard, half the amount was lost in the surf when the jolly boat foundered, and the remainder buried where doubtless that hospitable resident Johnson was able to find most of it. Silver dollars were too heavy to be carried away in bulk by stranded pirates fleeing the law, and these rascals got no good of their plunder. Glance at the sin-stained roster of famous pirates: Edward Lowe, Captain England, Captain Thomas White, Benito de Soto, Captain Roberts, Captain John Rackham, Captain Thomas Tew, and most of the bloody crew. And it will be found that either they wasted their treasure in debaucheries, or were hanged, shot, or drowned with empty pockets. Of them all, Blackbeard fills the eye most struttingly as the proper pirate to have buried treasure. He was immensely theatrical, fond of playing the part right up to the hilt, and we may rest assured that unless his sudden taking off prevented, he was at pains to bury at least one sea chest full of treasure in order to live up to the best traditions of his calling. He was prosperous, and unlike most of his lesser brethren, suffered no low tides of fortune. By rights, he should be a far more famous character than Captain William Kidd, whose commonplace career was so signally devoid of purple patches. Blackbeard was a pirate right out of a book, as the saying is. How this Captain Edward Teach swaggered through the streets of Charleston and terrorized the Carolinas and Bermuda is an old story, as is also the thrilling narrative of his capture, after a desperate battle, by brave Lieutenant Maynard, who hung the pirate's head from his bowsprit and sailed home in triumph. There are touches here and there, however, in the authentic biography of Blackbeard, which seem to belong in a discussion of buried treasure, for he was so very much the kind of flamboyant rogue that legend paints as infernally busy with pick and shovel on dark and lonely beaches. Blackbeard is the hero of such extremely diverting tales as these, which sundry writers have not scrupled to appropriate, either for purposes of fiction or blushingly to fit them to poor Captain Kidd as chroniclers of fact. In the commonwealth of pirates, he who goes the greatest length of wickedness is looked upon with a kind of envy amongst them, as a person of a most extraordinary gallantry. He is therefore entitled to be distinguished by some post, and if such a one has but courage, he must certainly be a great man. The hero of whom we are writing was thoroughly accomplished in this way, and some of his frolics of wickedness were as extravagant as if he aimed at making his men believe he was a devil incarnate. Being one day at sea, and a little flushed with drink, "Come," said he, "let us make a hell of our own, and try how long we can bear it." Accordingly he, with 2 or 3 others, went down into the hold, and closing up all the hatches, filled several pots full of brimstone and other combustible matter. They then set it on fire, and so continued till they were almost suffocated, when some of the men cried out for air. At length he opened the hatches, not a little pleased that he had held out the longest. One night, Blackbeard, drinking in his cabin with Israel Hands and the pilot and another man, without any pretense took a small pair of pistols and cocked them under the table, which being perceived by the man, he went on deck, leaving the captain, Hands, and the pilot together. When his pistols were prepared, he extinguished the candle, crossed his arms, and fired at the company under the table. The one pistol did no execution, but the other wounded Hands in the knee. Interrogated concerning the meaning of this, he answered with an imprecation that if he did not now and then kill one of them, they would forget who he was. In Blackbeard's journal, which was taken, there were several memoranda of the following nature, all written with his own hand. Such a day, rum all out, our company somewhat sober, a damned confusion amongst us, rogues a-plotting, great talk of separation. So I looked sharp for a prize. Such a day took one with a great deal of liquor on board, so kept the company hot, damned hot, and all things went well again. Blackbeard derived his name from his long black beard, which, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face and terrified all America more than any comet that has ever appeared. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbon in small quantities, turn them about his ears. In time of action he wore a sling over his shoulder with 3 braces of pistols. He struck lighted matches under his hat, which appearing on both sides of his face and eyes, naturally fierce and wild, made him such a figure that the human imagination cannot form a conception of a fury more terrible and alarming. In the best account of his melodramatic exit from the life which he had adorned with so much distinction, there is a reference to buried treasure that must be set down as a classic of its kind. Upon the 17th of November, 1717, Lieutenant Maynard left James River in quest of Blackbeard, and on the evening of the 21st came in sight of the pirate. This expedition was fitted out with all possible secrecy, no boat being permitted to pass that might convey any intelligence, while care was taken to discover where the pirates were lurking. The hardened and infuriated pirate, having been often deceived by false intelligence, was the less attentive, nor was he convinced of his danger until he saw the sloops sent to apprehend him. Though he had then only 20 men on board, he prepared to give battle. Lieutenant Maynard arrived with his sloops in the evening and anchored, as he could not venture, under cloud of night, to go into the place where Blackbeard lay. The latter spent the night in drinking with the master of a trading vessel, with the same indifference as if no danger had been near. Nay, such was the desperate wickedness of this villain, that, it is reported, during the carousals of that night, one of his men asked him, in case anything should happen to him during the engagement with the 2 sloops which were waiting to attack him in the morning, whether his wife knew where he had buried his money. To this he impiously replied that nobody but himself and the devil knew where it was, and the longest liver should take it all. In the morning Maynard weighed, and sent his boat to take soundings, which, coming near the pirate, received her fire. Maynard then hoisted royal colors, and directly toward Blackbeard with every sail and oar. In a little while the pirate ran aground, and so did the king's vessels. Maynard lightened his vessel of the ballast and water, and made towards Blackbeard. Upon this the pirate hailed in his own rude style, "Damn you for villains, who are you, and from whence come you?" The lieutenant answered, "You may see from our colors we are no pirates." Blackbeard bade him send his boat on board, that he might see who he was. But Maynard replied, "I cannot spare my boat, but I will come on board of you as soon as I can with my sloop." Upon this Blackbeard took a glass of liquor and drank to him, saying, "I'll give no quarter, nor take any from you." Maynard replied, he expected no quarter from him, nor should he take any. It is to be presumed that the devil fell heir to Blackbeard's treasure, inasmuch as Lieutenant Maynard and his men fairly cut the pirate and his crew to pieces. Turn we now from such marauders as this to that greater generation of buccaneers, so called, who harried the Spanish treasure fleets in towns in the West Indies and on the coasts of the Isthmus and South and Central America. During the period when Port Royal, Jamaica, was the headquarters and recruiting station for these picturesque cutthroats, and Sir Henry Morgan was their bright particular star, there is the testimony of an eyewitness and participant to show that the blood-stained gold seldom tarried long enough with its owners to permit of burying it, and that they bothered their wicked heads very little about safeguarding the future. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, that tall black man, nearly 40 years old, whose favorite toast was "Damnation to him, whoever lives to wear a halter," was snuffed out in an action with a king's ship, and the manner of his life and melodramatic quality of his death suggest that he be mentioned herein as worthy of a place beside Blackbeard himself. Roberts has been overlooked by buried treasure legend, and this is odd, for he was a figure to inspire such tales. His flamboyant career opened in 1719, and was successful until the British man-of-war Swallow overhauled him on the African coast. His biographer, Captain Charles Johnson, writing while the episode was less than a decade old, and when the facts were readily obtainable, left us this fine picture of the fight. Roberts himself made a gallant figure at the time of the engagement, being dressed in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, red feather in his hat, a gold chain round his neck, with a diamond cross hanging to it, sword in his hand, and 2 pair of pistols hanging at the end of a silk sling flung over his shoulder, according to the fashion of the pirates. He is said to have given his orders with boldness and spirit, coming, according to what he had purposed, close to the man-of-war, received her fire, and then hoisted his black flag and returned it, shooting away from her with all the sail he could pack. But keeping his tacks down, either by the wind's shifting or ill steerage, or both, he was taken aback with his sails, and the Swallow came a second time very nigh to him. He had now perhaps finished the fight very desperately, if death, who took a swift passage and a grape shot, had not interposed and struck him directly on the throat. He settled himself on the tackles of a gun, which one Stevenson from the helm, observing, ran to his assistance, and not perceiving him wounded, swore at him and bid him stand up like a man. But when he found his mistake, and that Captain Roberts was certainly dead, He gushed into tears and wished the next shot might be his lot. They presently threw him overboard with his arms and ornaments on, according to the repeated request he had made in his life. There was no treasure for the stout-hearted scoundrels who were captured by the Swallow. They had diced with fortune and lost. An execution dock was waiting for them. They are worth a passing acquaintance, and it gives one a certain satisfaction to learn that they were impudently merry, saying when they viewed their nakedness that they had not one halfpenny left to give old Sharon to ferry them over to the Styx, and that their thin commons they would observe that they fell away so fast that they should not have weight enough to hang them. Sutton used to be very profane, and he happening to be in the same irons with another prisoner, who was more serious than ordinary, and read and prayed often, as became his condition, this man Sutton used to swear and ask him what he proposed by so much noise and devotion. Heaven, I hope, says the other. Heaven, you fool, says Sutton. Did you ever hear of any pirate going thither? Give me hell, it's a merrier place. I'll give Roberts a salute of 13 guns at entrance. After Morgan had sacked the rich city of Portobello, John Esquemeling wrote of the expedition. With these ships he arrived in a few days at the island of Cuba, where he sought out a place wherein, with all quiet and repose, he might make the dividend of the spoil they had got. They found in ready money 250,000 pieces of 8, besides all other merchandises, as cloth, linen, silks, and other goods. With this rich booty they sailed again thence to their common place of rendezvous, Jamaica. Being arrived, they passed here some time in all sorts of vices and debauchery, according to their common manner of doing, spending with huge prodigality what others had gained with no small labor and toil. Such of these pirates are found who will spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in one night, not leaving themselves, peradventure, a good shirt to wear in their backs in the morning. My own master would buy, on like occasions, a whole pipe of wine, and placing it in the street, would force everyone that passed by to drink with him, threatening also to pistol them in case they would not do it. At other times he would do the same with barrels of ale or beer, and very often, with both his hands, he would throw these liquors about the street and wet the clothes of such as walked by, without regarding whether he spoiled their apparel or not, were they men or women. Among themselves and to each other, these pirates are extremely liberal and free. If any one of them has lost his goods, which often happens in their manner of life, they freely give him, and make him partaker of what they have. In taverns and alehouses, they always have great credit, but in such houses as Jamaica, they ought not to run very deep in debt, seeing the inhabitants of that island easily sell one another for debt. Thus it happened to my patron, or master, to be sold for a debt of a tavern, wherein he had spent the greater part of his money. This man had, within the space of 3 months before, 3,000 pieces of 8 in ready cash, all of which he wasted in that short space of time, and became as poor as I have told you. The same free-handed and lurid manner of life prevailed on the little island of Tortuga, off the coast of Haiti, where the French and English buccaneers had a lawless kingdom of their own. In his account of the career of the infamous Lalane, Esquemeling goes on to say, Parting therefore thence, they took their course towards the island of Hispaniola, and arrived thither in 8 days, casting anchor in a port called Isla de la Vaca, or Cow Island. This isle is inhabited by French buccaneers, who most commonly sell the flesh they hunt to pirates and others, who now and then put in there, with intent of victualling or trading with them. Here they unladed the whole cargo of riches which they had robbed, the usual storehouse of the pirates being commonly under the shelter of the buccaneers. Here also they made a dividend amongst them of all their prizes and gains, according to that order and degree which belonged to everyone. Having cast up the account and made exact calculation of all they had purchased, they found in ready money 260,000 pieces of 8, whereupon, this being divided, everyone received to his share in money, also in pieces of silk, linen, and other commodities, the value of above 100 pieces of 8. Those who had been wounded in this expedition received their part before all the rest. I mean such recompenses as I spoke of in the first book, for the loss of their limbs which they may have sustained. Afterwards they weighed all the plate that was uncoined, reckoning after the rate of 10 pieces of 8 for every pound. The jewels were prized with much variety, either at too high or too low rates, being thus occasioned by their own ignorance. This being done, everyone was put to his oath again, that he had not concealed anything nor subtracted from the common stock. Hence they proceeded to the dividend of what shares belonged to such as were dead amongst them, either in battle or otherwise. These shares were given to their friends to be kept entire for them, and to be delivered in due time to their nearest relatives, or whomsoever should appear to be their lawful heirs. The whole dividend being entirely finished, they set sail thence for the Isle of Tortuga. Here they arrived 1 month after, to the great joy of most that were upon the island. Whereas to the common pirates, in 3 weeks they had scarce any money left them, having spent it all in things of little value, or at play, either at cards or dice. Here also arrived, not long before them, 2 French ships, laden with wine and brandy and other things of this kind, whereby these liquors, at the arrival of the pirates, were sold indifferent cheap. But this lasted not long, for soon after they were enhanced extremely, a gallon of brandy being sold for 4 pieces of 8. The governor of the island bought of the pirates the whole cargo ship laden with cacao, giving them for that rich commodity scarce the 20th part of what it was worth. Thus they made shift to lose and spend the riches they had got in much less time than they were purchased by robbing. The taverns, according to the custom of pirates, got the greatest part thereof, insomuch that soon after they were constrained to seek more by the same unlawful means they had obtained the preceding. Morgan himself buried none of his vast treasure, although legend persists in saying so, nor did he waste it in riotous living. From the looting of Panama alone he took booty to the value of $2 million as his share, and he had no need to hide it. He was thought so well of in England that Charles II knighted him, and he was appointed commissary of the Admiralty. For some time he lived in England, published his Voyage to Panama in 1683, and spent his remaining years in Jamaica as an opulent and influential person in high favor with the ruling powers, and a terror to the luckless, beggared comrades who had helped him win his fortune. As governor of the island he hanged as many as he could lay hands on, a kind of ingratitude not at all inconsistent with the traits of character he had displayed as a pirate. He did not hesitate to rob his own men, according to Esquemeling, from whose narrative of the great expedition against Panama the following paragraphs are taken as indicative of the methods of this great freebooter of the Spanish Main.
Not long after Captain Morgan arrived at Jamaica, he found many of his chief officers and soldiers reduced to their former state of indigence through their immoderate vices and debauchery. Hence they ceased not to importune him for new invasions and exploits, thereby to get something to expend anew in wine, as they had already wasted what was secured so little before. Captain Morgan, being willing to follow fortune while she called him, hereupon stopped the mouths of many of the inhabitants of Jamaica, who were creditors to his men for large sums of money, with the hopes and promises he gave them of greater achievements than ever by a new expedition he was going about. This being done, he needed not to give himself much concern to levy men for this or any other enterprise, his name being now so famous through all those islands that alone would readily bring him in more men than he could readily employ. He undertook, therefore, to equip a new fleet of ships, for which purpose he assigned the south side of the Isle of Tortuga as a place of rendezvous. With this resolution he wrote diverse letters to all the ancient and expert pirates there inhabiting, as also to the governor of the said isle, and to the planters and hunters of Hispaniola, giving them to understand his intentions, and desiring their appearance at the said place, in case they intended to go with him. All these people had no sooner understood his designs than they flocked to the place assigned in huge numbers, ships, canoes, and boats, being desirous to obey his commands. Thus all were present at the place assigned, and in readiness against the 24th day of October, 1670.
Special articles of agreement for the division of the treasure of Panama were drawn up by Morgan before his fleet sailed. Herein it was stipulated that he should have the 100th part of all that was gotten to himself alone, that every captain should draw the shares of 8 men for the expenses of his ship besides his own, that the surgeon, besides his ordinary pay, should have 200 pieces of 8 for his chest of medicine, and every carpenter, above his common salary, should draw 100 pieces of 8. Lastly, unto him that in any battle should signalize himself, either by entering first any castle, or taking down the Spanish colors and setting up the English, they constituted 50 pieces of 8 for a reward. In the head of these articles it was stipulated that all these extraordinary salaries, recompenses, and rewards should be paid out of the first spoil or purchase they should take, according as every one should then occur to be either rewarded or paid. The expedition was a gorgeous success, for on the 24th of February of the year 1671, Captain Morgan departed from the city of Panama, or rather from the place where the said city of Panama had stood, of the spoils whereof he carried with him 175 beasts of carriage, laden with silver, gold, and other precious things, besides 600 prisoners, more or less, between men, women, children, and slaves, about the middle of the way to the castle of Chagre. Captain Morgan commanded his men to be placed in due order, according to their custom, and caused every one to be sworn that they had reserved, nor concealed nothing privately to themselves, even not so much as the value of sixpence. This being done, Captain Morgan, having had some experience that those lewd fellows would not much stickle to swear falsely in points of interest, he commanded every one to be searched very strictly, both in their clothes and satchels, and everywhere it might be presumed they had reserved anything. Yea, to the intent this order might not be ill taken by his companions, he permitted himself to be searched, even to the very soles of his shoes. To this office, by common consent, there was assigned one out of every company to be the searcher of all the rest. The French pirates that went on this expedition with Captain Morgan were not well satisfied with this new custom of searching. From Chagre, Captain Morgan sent presently after his arrival a great boat to Portobello, wherein were all the prisoners he had taken at the Isle of St. Catherine, demanding by them a considerable ransom for the castle of Chagre, where he then was, threatening otherwise to ruin and demolish it even to the ground. To this message those of Portobello made answer that they would not give 1 farthing towards the ransom of the said castle, and that the English might do with it as they pleased. The answer being come, the dividend was made of all the spoil they had purchased in that voyage. Thus every company and every particular person therein included received their portion of what was got, or rather, what part thereof Captain Morgan was pleased to give them. For so it was that the rest of his companions, even of his own nation, complained of his proceedings in this particular, and feared not to tell him openly to his face that he had reserved the best jewels to himself, for they judged it impossible that no greater share should belong to them than 200 pieces of 8 per capita, of so many valuable booties and robberies as they had obtained, which small sum they thought too little reward for so much labor and such huge and manifest dangers as they had often exposed their lives to. But Captain Morgan was deaf to all these and many other complaints of this kind, having designed in his mind to cheat them of as much as he could. At last, Captain Morgan, finding himself obnoxious to many obloquies and detractions among his people, began to fear the consequences thereof, and hereupon, thinking it unsafe to remain any longer time at Chagre, he commanded the ordnance of the said castle to be carried on board his ship. Afterwards he caused the greatest part of the walls to be demolished, and the edifices to be burnt, and as many other things spoiled and ruined as could conveniently be done in a short while. These orders being performed, he went secretly on board his own ship, without giving any notice of his departure to his companions, nor calling any council, as he used to do. Thus he set sail and put out to sea, not bidding anybody adieu, being only followed by 3 or 4 vessels of the whole fleet. These were such, as the French pirates believed, as went shares with Captain Morgan, towards the best and greatest part of the spoil which had been concealed from them in the dividend. The Frenchmen would very willingly have revenged this affront upon Captain Morgan and those that followed him, had they found themselves with sufficient means to encounter him at sea, but they were destitute of most things necessary thereto. Yea, they had much ado to find sufficient victuals and provisions for their voyage to Panama, he having left them totally unprovided of all things. Esquemeling's commentary on this base conduct of the leader is surprisingly pious. Captain Morgan left us all in such a miserable condition as might serve for our lively representation what reward attends wickedness at the latter end of life, whence we ought to have learned how to regulate and amend our actions for the future. Sir Francis Drake, sea king of the 16th century, the greatest admiral of the time, belongs not with the catalogue of pirates and buccaneers, yet he left a true tale of buried treasure among his exploits, and it is highly probable that some of that rich plunder is hidden today in the steaming jungle of the road he took to Panama. There were only 48 Englishmen in the band which he led on the famous raid to ambush the Spanish treasure train bound to Nombre de Dios. A century before Morgan's raiders crossed the isthmus, this first attempt resulted in failure, but after sundry adventures Drake returned and hid his little force close by that famous treasure port of Nombre de Dios, where they waited to hear the bells of the pack mule caravan moving along the trail from Panama. It was at dawn when this distant, tinkling music was first heard, and the Cimarroons, or Indian guides, were jubilant. Now they assured us we should have more gold and silver than all of us could bear away. Soon the Englishmen had glimpses of 3 royal treasure trains plodding along the leafy road, one of 50 mules, the other of 70 each, and every one of them laden with 300 pounds weight of silver bullion, or 30 tons in all. The guard of 45 Spanish soldiers loafed carelessly in front and rear, their guns slung on their backs. Drake and his bold seamen poured down from a hill, put the guard to flight, and captured the caravan with the loss of only 2 men. There was more plunder than they could carry back to their ships in a hasty retreat, and being wary, they were content with a few bars and quoits of gold. The silver was buried in the expectation of returning for it later, partly in the burrows which the great land crabs have made in the earth, and partly under old trees which are fallen thereabouts, and partly in the sand and gravel of a river not very deep of water. Then began a forced march, every man burdened with all the treasure he could carry, and behind them the noise of both horse and foot coming, as it seemed, to the mules. Presently a wounded French captain became so exhausted that he had to drop out, refusing to delay the march and telling the company that he would remain behind in the woods with 2 of his men, in hope that some rest would recover his better strength. Ere long another Frenchman was missed, and investigation discovered that he had drunk much wine, and doubtless desired to sleep it off. Reaching Rio Francisco, Drake was dismayed to find his pinnacles gone and his party stranded. The vessels were recovered after delay and perilous adventure, whereupon Drake hastened to prepare another expedition to get intelligence in what case the country stood, and, if might be, recover Monsieur Tetu, the French captain, and leastwise bring away the buried silver. The party was just about to start inland when on the beach appeared one of the 2 men who had stayed behind with the French captain. At the sight of Drake, he fell down on his knees, blessing God for the time that ever our captain was born, who now beyond all his hope was become his deliverer. He related that soon after they had been left behind in the forest, the Spaniards had captured Captain Tetu and the other man. He himself had escaped by throwing down his treasure and taking to his heels. Concerning the buried silver, he had lamentable tidings to impart. The Spanish had got wind of it, and he thought there had been near 2,000 Spaniards and Negroes there to dig and search for it. However, the expedition pushed forward, and the news was confirmed. The earth every way a mile distant had been digged and turned up in every place of any likelihood to have anything hidden in it. It was learned that the general location of the silver had been divulged to the Spaniards by that rascally Frenchman who had got drunk and deserted during the march to the coast. He had been caught while asleep, and the soldiers from Nombre de Dios tortured him until he told all that he knew about the treasure. The Englishmen poked around and quickly found 13 bars of silver and some few quoits of gold, with which they posted back to Rio Francisco, not daring to linger in the neighborhood of an overwhelming force of the enemy. It was there believed that the Spanish recovered by no means all of those precious tons of silver bullion, and Drake made sail very reluctantly. It may well be that a handsome hoard still awaits the search of some modern Argonauts, or that the steam shovels of the workmen of the Panama Canal may sometime swing aloft a burden of bars of silver and quoits of gold in their mighty buckets. Certain it is that Sir Francis Drake is to be numbered among that romantic company of sea rovers of other days who buried vast treasure upon the Spanish main. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. The Book of Buried Treasure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine. Chapter 16. Practical Hints for Treasure Seekers. Faith, imagination, and a vigorous physique comprise the essential equipment of a treasure seeker. Capital is desirable, but not absolutely necessary, for it would be hard indeed to find a neighborhood in which some legend or other of buried gold is not current. If one is unable to finance an expedition aboard a swift, black-hulled schooner, it is always possible to dig for the treasure of poor Captain Kidd, and it is really a matter of small importance that he left no treasure in his wake. The zest of the game is in seeking. A pick and shovel are to be obtained in the woodshed or can be purchased at the nearest hardware store for a modest outlay. A pirate's chart is to be highly esteemed, but if the genuine article cannot be found, there are elderly seafaring men in every port who will furnish one just as good and perjure themselves as to the information thereof with all the cheerfulness in the world. It has occurred to the author that a concise directory of the best known lost and buried treasure might be of some service to persons of an adventurous turn of mind, and the following tabloid guide for ready reference may perhaps prove helpful, particularly to parents of small boys who have designs on pirate hordes, as well as to boys who have never grown up. Cocos Island, in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Costa Rica. $12 million in plate, coin, bar gold, and jewels buried by buccaneers and by seamen who pirated the treasure of Lima. Trinidad, in the South Atlantic off the coast of Brazil. The vast booty of sea rovers who plundered the richest cities of South America. A very delectable and well authenticated treasure indeed, with all the proper charts and appurtenances. Specially recommended. The Salvages, a group of small islands to the southward of Madeira. $2 million of silver in chests, buried by the crew of a Spanish ship in 1804. They killed their captain and laid him on top of the treasure, wherefore proper precautions must be taken to appease his ghost before beginning to dig. Cape St. Vincent, west coast of Madagascar. The wreck of a Dutch-built ship of great age is jammed fast between the rocks. Gold and silver money has been washed from her and cast up on the beach, and a large fortune still remains among her timbers. Expeditions are advised to fit out at Mozambique. Venanguembe Bay, 35 miles south-southwest of Nagansi Island on the east coast of Madagascar. A sunken treasure is supposed to be not far from the wreck of the French frigate Glory, lost in 1761. Expeditions will do well to keep a weather eye lifted along all this coast for the treasures of the pirates who infested these waters in the days of Captain Kidd. Gow Island, sometimes called Diego Alvarez. Latitude 40 degrees, 19 minutes south. Longitude 9 degrees, 44 minutes west. It is well known that on this unfrequented bit of sea-washed real estate, a very wicked pirate or pirates deposited ill-gotten gains. The place to dig is close to a conspicuous spire or pinnacle of stone on the western end of the island, the name of which natural landmark is set down on the charts as Church Rock. Juan Fernandez, South Pacific, famed as the abode of Robinson Crusoe, who was too busy writing the story of his life to find the buccaneer's wealth concealed in a cave. Also the wreck of a Spanish galleon reputed to have been laden with bullion from the mines of Peru. Auckland Islands, remote and far to the southward and hardly to be recommended to the amateur treasure seeker, who had better serve as apprenticeship nearer home. Frequently visited by expeditions from Melbourne and Sydney, in 1866 the sailing ship General Grant, bound from Australia to London, was lost here. In her cargo were 50,000 ounces of gold. In a most extraordinary manner the vessel was driven by the seas into a great cavern in the cliff, from which only a handful of her people managed to escape. They lived for 18 months on this desert island before being taken off. The hulk of the General Grant is still within the cave, but the undertow and the great combers have thus far baffled the divers. Luzon, one of the Philippine Islands, near Calumpit, in the swamps of the Rio Grande. The Chinese Mandarin Chan Li Sui buried his incalculable wealth soon after the British captured Manila in 1762. His jewels were dazzling, and a string of pearls, bought from the Sultan of Sulu, was said to be the finest in the Orient. Nightingale Island, near Tristan da Cunha, South Atlantic. One chest of pirate silver was found here and brought to the United States, but much more is said to remain hidden. Tobermory Bay, Island of Mull, Western Scotland. Wreck of the galleon Florencia of the Spanish Armada, said to have contained 30 millions of treasure. Permission to investigate must be obtained from His Grace, the Duke of Argyll. Vigo Bay, coast of Spain. Spanish plate fleet sunk by the English and Dutch. A trifling matter of $100 million or more, waiting for the right man to come along and fish them up. Treasure seekers had better first consult the Spanish government at Madrid in order to avoid misunderstandings with the local officials. East River, Manhattan Island, New York. Wreck of the British frigate Hussar, which carried to the bottom in 1780 more than $2.5 million in gold consigned to the paymasters of the Army and Naval forces that were fighting the American forces of George Washington. She was sailing for Newport and struck a rock nearly opposite the upper end of Randall's Island, sinking 100 yards from shore. Oak Island, Nova Scotia, near Chester. Unmistakable remains of a deep shaft sunk by pirates in an underground connection with the bay. A company is now digging and will probably sell shares at a reasonable price. Buying shares in a treasure company is less fatiguing than handling the pick and shovel oneself. Isthmus of Panama, direction somewhat vague. Sir Francis Drake left part of the loot of old Panama concealed along his line of retreat, but none of his crew was considerate enough to transmit to posterity a chart marked with the proper crosses and bearings. Dollar Cove, Mounts Bay, Cornwall, wreck of a treasure ship St. Andrew belonging to the King of Portugal, driven out of her course from Flanders to a home port in 1526. An ancient document written by one Thomas Porson, an Englishman on board, states that, by the grace and mercy of God, the greater part of the crew got safely to land, and that, assisted by some of the inhabitants, they also saved part of the cargo, including blocks of silver bullion, silver vessels and plate, precious stones, brooches, and chains of gold, cloths of Arras, tapestry, satins, velvets, and 4 sets of armor for the King of Portugal. According to Porson, no sooner had these treasures been carried to the top of the cliffs than 3 local squires with 60 armed retainers attacked the shipwrecked men and carried off the booty. Modern treasure seekers disbelieve this document and prefer the statement of one of the squires concerned, St. Aubin by name, that they rode to the place, give what help they could, but the cargo of treasure could not be saved. Cape Vidal, coast of Zululand. Wreck of a mysterious sailing vessel, Dorothea, said to have had a huge fortune in gold bricks cemented under his floor. Stolen gold from the mines of the Rand. In 1900, May 21st, an item in the government estimates of the Legislative Assembly in the Natal Parliament was discussed under the heading, Expenditure in Connection with Buried Gold at Cape Vidal. Search for discovery, £173, 19 shillings, 3 pence. Mr. Evans asked if a syndicate had been formed and what expectations the government had to give. Hear, hear. The Prime Minister said there were several syndicates formed to raise the treasure. The government had reason to believe that they knew where the treasure was hidden and started an expedition on their own account. But unfortunately, they had not been able to find the treasure. Mr. Evans, the government was in for a bad spec. Laughter. The item passed. Space is given to the foregoing because it stamps with official authority the story of the treasure of Cape Vidal. When the government goes treasure hunting, there must be something in it. Lake Guadavita, near Bogota, Republic of Colombia. The treasure of El Dorado, the Gilded Man. To find this gold involves driving a tunnel through the side of a mountain and draining the lake. This is such a formidable undertaking that it will not appeal to the average treasure seeker, unless, perchance, he might pick up a second-hand tunnel somewhere at a bargain price. Even then, transportation from the sea coast to Bogota is so difficult and costly that it would hardly be practicable to saw the tunnel into sections and have it carried over the mountains on muleback. The end. End of chapter 16. End of The Book of Buried Treasure by Ralph Delahaye Paine.